Hey guys, tonight we slip into the soft, golden haze of a Victorian evening where gas lamps throw their flickering halos across cobblestones, still damp from an afternoon drizzle. You can almost hear the hiss of the flame behind the glass, the faint rattle of carriage wheels, the polite clink of walking canes against stone. You probably won't survive this, at least not without a bit of a yawn, because we're heading into the sleepless heart of the 19th century, a time when insomnia wasn't just a nuisance, it was practically a social accessory. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're joining me from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stroll down a narrow London lane, your boots making a faint, wet thud on the uneven stones. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. In windows along the street, curtains billow like ghosts in the evening draught, and behind them, sleepless Victorians linger in parlors, sipping dark, syrupy concoctions or reading by the amber glow of gaslight. Back then, gaslight wasn't just a way to see after sunset, it was a lifestyle. And unfortunately, it was also terrible for sleep. The harsh spectrum and steady flicker played tricks on the human brain, telling it, hey, it's still daylight, don't bother winding down. Historians still argue whether the late-night culture that bloomed during the gaslight era was more a product of newfound leisure or an unintended side effect of bad lighting technology. Either way, you can imagine the ripple effect. People staying up later, gossiping in drawing rooms, playing piano for midnight guests. And when they finally tried to sleep, their minds were buzzing, their eyes prickled from the light, and sleep drifted away like a cat who's decided it no longer likes you. As you pass a tavern, the windows glow warm and inviting. Inside, a crowd leans close over tankards, laughing. It's not the kind of raucous noise that shatters the night. It's softer, more like a low tide of conversation. But here's the thing. Victorian streets were never truly quiet. Somewhere down the block, a night watchman calls the hour, his voice echoing off brick. A horse snorts, iron shoes striking sparks on the road. It's the kind of background soundtrack that might lull some people, but for others, especially the fashionable insomniacs, it was yet another reason to toss and turn. In the shadow of a lamppost, you notice a printed handbill pasted to the wall. The most soothing slumber syrup assures dreamless nights. Below, an illustration of a cherubic child asleep under a starry sky, probably the most peaceful-looking person in all of London. You can't help but smirk. Half the city seems to be running on promises like that. One quirky detail you might appreciate, insomnia wasn't just something Victorians complained about. It was sometimes something they performed. Staying up late, rising early, sighing over one's delicate nerves, it all hinted at refinement. After all, who had time to be sleepless except those who didn't need to labor from dawn to dusk? If you were middle or upper class, you could afford to look pale and wistful. You could afford to buy the latest imported tea formulated to help you rest. Never mind that it sometimes contained more caffeine than your average coffee shop latte. You wander past a terrace of respectable brick homes. Behind one window, a man in a dressing gown stares at the ceiling, lips moving as if counting something. Sheep, maybe. or debts. In another, a young woman flips through a book of poetry, candlelight pooling on the pages. There's a strange intimacy to it, catching these tiny private moments where people are quietly losing the battle against their own thoughts. Your own boots slow, and you lean against a wrought iron railing, letting the lamplight paint your sleeve. This is where the story really begins, not with the cures themselves, but with the atmosphere that made them necessary. The Victorian night wasn't dark the way we know darkness. It was stitched together from islands of light, each gas lamp humming faintly, their flames nibbling at the shadows. And that light, combined with a culture in love with its own wakefulness, set the stage for a booming industry of sleep aids, some ingenious, some absurd, and some outright dangerous. One more thing you can't ignore: the way time felt slower here. Without the constant glow of screens, people measured the night in other ways. The cooling of tea, the ticking of a mantel clock, the gradual dimming of a gas lamp when the pressure faltered. And when you were awake through it all, every sound and flicker seemed sharper. The weight of sleeplessness pressed differently here, quieter, heavier, almost theatrical. You push yourself upright again, heading toward the glow of a shop window. Inside, bottles gleam in neat rows, amber glass catching the lamplight. The labels promise peace, comfort, gentle dreams. You already know some of them hide ingredients that could knock out a small horse. But for now, you just stand there, watching the glass shimmer, thinking about how the Victorians turned sleeplessness into a canvas, something to be adorned, managed, and paraded. And as the gas lamps hum softly above you, you can't help but think maybe they weren't really trying to cure insomnia at all. Maybe, in their own strange way, they were cultivating it. You step away from that glowing shop window, and the street bends toward a quieter quarter, where grand townhouses loom like watchful elders. Their tall windows are curtained, but a thin seam of light escapes here and there, a reminder that even behind the most respectable facades, someone is still awake. You imagine them lying on thick feather mattresses, an indulgence of the Victorian well-to-do, yet staring at the ceiling as if the plaster might whisper answers. Feather beds, the pride of a well-appointed bedroom, promised heavenly rest. You sink into one now just to feel it, the initial bliss of soft down rising around your shoulders like being swallowed by a warm cloud. But you notice something else. Under the rich floral wallpaper, the faint smell of soot. It's the coal smoke that seeps in from the chimney uninvited, threading its way into every pillow and curtain. Even the richest homes couldn't keep it entirely at bay. It's not choking or sharp, but persistent, clinging to your hair and lining your throat. And then there's the noise, not the obvious jarring kind, but the persistent thrum of a city that has learned to be nocturnal. Coal wagons still clatter along side streets in the small hours. Somewhere, a boiler hisses like a sleepy serpent. The hiss might soothe you, if you weren't already straining for silence. Historians still argue whether it was the industrial noise or the very comfort of these homes that made insomnia so pronounced among the wealthier classes. After all, when you don't have to rise at dawn to scrub laundry or haul water, your mind has more room to wander, and wandering minds rarely respect bedtime. You roll to one side, and your face sinks deeper into the feather pillow. It's warm from your breath, and you think of the Victorian housewives who fluffed these beds daily, believing that loft and softness equaled better sleep. What they didn't know, or didn't admit, was that these dense nests trapped heat and moisture, sometimes leading to restlessness. In summer, they could be stifling. In winter, they were an overstuffed trap. Some households tried to improve matters with open windows, even in the cold. Imagine lying in that downy embrace while the icy London night presses in, coal smoke mingling with the faint metallic tang of frost. You'd pull the covers tight, listening to the wooden frame creak as you shift. Still, the air would feel both too cold and somehow too heavy to lull you. In the poorer districts, of course, the story was different. Thin blankets, straw mattresses, and little protection from the drafts. Ironically, some of those sleepers might have been too exhausted to suffer from insomnia at all. But in the genteel parlors and boudoirs, sleeplessness could thrive. It had the perfect habitat, warmth, stillness, and a mind unburdened by survival, yet restless for novelty. One quirky footnote here. Some Victorians believed that a bed should face a particular direction, often north, to promote better rest. This idea wandered in from a mix of folk wisdom and half-remembered scientific theory. You picture someone dragging their ornate bedstead across the rug at midnight, hoping a change of compass bearing might finally hush their thoughts. You glance toward the heavy drapes where faint light from a gas lamp bleeds through. The fabric smells faintly of lavender, a standard touch in well-off homes, but tonight it's not enough to soothe you. Outside, you hear the muted chime of a nearby clock tower marking the hour, past midnight now. Somewhere in the building, a pipe knocks as steam surges through it, the sound oddly percussive in the stillness. You flip the pillow to its cooler side, a small defiant act against the heat trapped by the feather bed. The sensation is blissful for about 10 seconds before the warmth creeps back. Victorian insomnia was full of these tiny fleeting victories. A sip of water, a brief lull in the noise outside, before the mind found new ways to stay awake. The fashion of the time insisted that a refined home must offer absolute comfort. Plush carpets, thick curtains, rich bedding, all meant to envelop the sleeper. Yet the more insulated from the world they became, the more attuned they were to every small disturbance. The scratch of a mouse in the wainscoting, the sigh of wind in the chimney, the faint ticking of an expensive clock. It's almost funny, though maybe not if you were living it, that people could lie in such luxury and still feel under siege by wakefulness. And it wasn't just the mind's fault. The room's very atmosphere seemed engineered to be almost perfect for sleep, but not quite. Too warm, too scented, too sealed from fresh air. You lie there, listening to the faint whisper of coal ash settling in the hearth, and realize that in this setting, sleeplessness isn't an accident. It's a consequence of the era's own comforts. The same beds that cradled the Victorian elite also held them hostage night after night. You leave the warmth of that overstuffed feather bed behind and drift down another stretch of lamplit street. The mist has thickened, curling low around your ankles like a cat determined to trip you. Ahead, you spot another shop, this one almost gaudy in its determination to be noticed. Bright paper placards shout promises in bold serif letters. Guaranteed rest, gentle, natural, perfectly harmless, which in Victorian marketing speak usually meant brace yourself. This might knock you into next week. You step inside, and the air is heavy with competing scents. Camphor, sugar syrup, a faint chemical tang you can't quite name. Shelves groan under neat rows of bottles, tins, and boxes, each one promising relief from sleepless nights. There's Dr. Fowler's phosphoric elixir, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, and Sleep Ease lozenges, all lined up like soldiers in a dreamless army. The glass gleams under the dim lamps, labels boasting phrases like purely botanical and perfect for ladies, gentlemen, and children. Historians still argue whether the Victorian faith in these patent medicines was driven more by genuine belief or by a kind of collective denial about what was in them. Because here's the truth. Many of these so-called harmless remedies were laced with opiates, chloroform, alcohol, or all three. You could take a spoonful before bed and wake up wondering if you'd accidentally traveled forward in time. One bottle in particular catches your eye. The glass is dark, almost black, with a gilded label promising sleep without dreams. You turn it over in your hand, the syrup inside moving sluggishly. The shopkeeper, a man with whiskers that could double as a Victorian side hustle, leans in conspiratorially. "Bestseller," he says, as though confessing a family secret. "Ladies swear by it, gentlemen too, though they won't admit it. There's a quirky detail here that's too good to skip. The Victorian patent medicine boom was fueled not just by insomnia itself, but by new laws, loosely enforced, that let anyone with a flair for advertising sell their concoctions. You didn't need to prove it worked. You just needed an elegant label, a persuasive handbill, and preferably a celebrity endorsement from some well-known insomniac aristocrat. You wander deeper into the shop, brushing past hanging bundles of dried herbs meant for more natural cures. Lavender, hops, chamomile, these are sold alongside the stronger stuff, as if proximity alone could make them equally effective. Somewhere in the back, you hear the clink of glass as an assistant refills bottles from a much larger jug. You can guess what's in it. Something sticky, sweet, and potent enough to flatten a small dog. And here's the thing, these cures did work, at least for a while. The opium would pull a heavy velvet curtain across your thoughts. The alcohol would loosen your body, and the next thing you knew, it was morning. The problem, of course, was that repeated use made your body demand more of the stuff just to get the same effect. By the time anyone realized they were hooked, their nights without the syrup felt longer and crueler than ever. You leave the shop, the bell above the door tinkling softly, and step back into the fog. In your pocket, you can almost feel the phantom weight of one of those bottles, as if you'd been tempted to buy it. The lamps blur into golden halos through the mist, and you think about how easily a sleepless Victorian could have convinced themselves that they were making a sensible choice. The city around you is full of people right now doing the same, sitting at their dressing tables, pouring a measure of syrup into a spoon, the lamplight catching in the glass. The liquid glistens like molasses, slow to drip, the smell sharp and sweet. They tilt it back, swallow, and wait for the fog to roll in. The funny part, though maybe not ha-ha funny, is that the Victorians had access to remedies that might actually have helped in the long run. Fresh air, exercise, simpler diets. But the allure of an instant solution was hard to resist, especially when it came in a handsome bottle with embossed lettering. You keep walking, the shop fading behind you, and it's almost possible to imagine a London where the shelves are empty, the placards gone, and the sleepless are left to solve their own restlessness without the crutch of syrup or powder. Would they have slept better? Historians still argue about that too. All you know is that the patent medicine parade is just getting started, and the Victorians are marching along happily, clutching their cures like tiny glass talismans against the night. You turn down a quieter lane, following the faint clink of porcelain. Through a lace-curtained window, you catch a glimpse of a silver tray being carried into a parlor. An elegant pot of tea, steam curling upward in ghostly ribbons. You can almost smell it from here, floral, earthy, faintly bitter. Only when you step inside do you notice the faint, metallic sweetness beneath it. That's no ordinary tea. The hostess smiles, motioning you toward a wingback chair. She pours a delicate stream of amber liquid into your cup, the light catching it like liquid topaz. "A little laudanum," she says, in a voice so casual it could be sugar. Takes the edge off. You stir, watching the swirl disappear into the drink, and wonder how many of the so-called ladies' tonics in this city are laced with the same potent secret. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, was the Victorian Swiss Army knife of medicine. Got a cough? Take laudanum. An upset stomach? Laudanum. Sleepless night? Oh, absolutely laudanum. It was legal, cheap, and socially acceptable, which meant it could glide into teacups at evening gatherings without anyone batting an eye. The strange part is how often it was used for children. A few drops in a baby's milk to keep them quiet through the night. That detail alone is enough to make you stare into your cup a little longer before taking a cautious sip. Historians still argue whether most Victorians truly understood the addictive nature of their beloved opiate, or whether they just didn't want to admit it. Opium dens, after all, were the scandalous domain of sailors and the underclass. But laudanum? That came in an elegant bottle, often with a gold-embossed label. It was respectable. You take a sip. The warmth spreads almost instantly, a creeping softness in your limbs, a quieting of the constant hum in your head. You can see why this became a fixture of the sleepless elite. No tossing and turning for hours, just a quick glide into oblivion. Of course, morning would be another story. Many laudanum drinkers woke groggy, irritable, and even more dependent on that evening dose. But in this moment, in this cozy, dimly lit parlor, you can almost believe in its charm. One quirky scene plays out across the room. A gentleman in a brocade waistcoat leans over a chessboard, his eyes glassy but fixed on the game. He moves a pawn, slowly, deliberately, as if underwater. His opponent, equally drowsy, chuckles softly. The entire pace of the gathering has slowed to a dreamy crawl. Conversations trailing off mid-sentence, cups cooling in hands. The fire crackles, and time seems suspended. The hostess offers you a plate of biscuits, another small trick. The starch helps mask the bitter aftertaste of the opium. You take one, its sugary crunch oddly grounding against the creeping fog in your mind. The talk turns to nerves, that all-purpose Victorian diagnosis for anything from anxiety to indigestion to, of course, insomnia. Remedies are exchanged like gossip. Some swear by laudanum, others by chloral hydrate, and a few insist that a brandy nightcap is all anyone needs. As the evening winds down, you notice the telltale signs, the slow, exaggerated blinks, the slouched shoulders, the faint smiles that don't quite reach the eyes. Everyone here will sleep soundly tonight, or at least think they did. And tomorrow, when the headache comes, when the world feels just a little too sharp, they'll reach for the same little bottle again. You leave the parlor, stepping back into the street. The fog has thickened, blurring the gaslight halos until they seem to drift in midair. Somewhere behind you, the clink of teacups fades. You can still taste the laudanum, sweet and bitter all at once, and you know it's not the last time you'll encounter it on this journey. And as you walk, the thought settles in like a whisper. In Victorian London, sleep often came not as a gentle invitation, but as a chemical coup, a velvet glove with iron fingers pulling the mind down into darkness whether it was ready or not. You wander deeper into the fog, your shoes ticking on damp cobblestones until a new sound emerges. Metal gears, a faint hum, and the occasional clunk that seems to belong more in a factory than a bedroom. Following the noise, you arrive at a narrow shop whose window is crammed with contraptions that look like they've escaped from an inventor's fever dream. There are brass cranks, wooden frames, pulleys, springs, and even a miniature water wheel. Above the display hangs a painted sign, "Mechanical restorers of the sleep-deprived, guaranteed." You push open the door, and the scent of oiled wood and machine grease greets you. Inside, the proprietor, a wiry man with a walrus mustache, gestures proudly to his creations. "Why rely on fickle herbs or dangerous syrups," he says, "when you can harness the precision of engineering?" You glance around at a gallery of what might generously be called bedroom machines. One bed frame rocks gently on a set of curved runners, the motion driven by a hidden clockwork. Another stands tall on iron legs, fitted with a mechanism that lifts and lowers the mattress every few seconds, supposedly to lull the body into a deeper rest. On the far wall, a device resembling a giant metronome swings over a pillow, casting a slow-moving shadow to hypnotize the restless. Historians still argue whether these mechanical marvels were genuinely intended to help people sleep, or whether they were just another way for inventive Victorians to part the sleepless from their money. Some designs bordered on the absurd, a mattress that vibrated like a cat purring, or a pillow fitted with tiny bellows to breathe lavender air into your face every 5 minutes. You watch as the shopkeeper demonstrates one of his newest inventions, a sleep oscillator. The mattress tilts back and forth at a pace that's somewhere between a gentle rock and a ride on a lazy river. The motion mimics the cradling of infancy, he explains, puffing out his chest. The body remembers. It's tempting, but you can't help imagining yourself sliding slowly toward the edge all night until you wake in a heap on the floor. A quirky little model sits in the corner, a bed that jolts every half hour. For those who wake frequently, the inventor says, it encourages the body to re-enter slumber. You try to picture someone being rattled back to sleep, like a stubborn drawer shoved shut, and decide the logic might be questionable. Despite the eccentricity, there's a certain charm to it all. The Victorians loved to believe that every problem could be solved with a clever gadget, especially if it combined beauty and brass. Some of these beds gleam like works of art. Polished mahogany frames inlaid with mother-of-pearl, brass fittings catching the lamplight. You could almost forget they were meant for sleeping and not for showing off to dinner guests. The inventor invites you to lie down on one of his models, a softly padded contraption that vibrates with a low hum when he turns a crank. The sensation is oddly pleasant at first, the vibration traveling up your spine like a cat's purr. You close your eyes, half expecting it to actually work. But as the minutes stretch, the hum becomes more insistent, your teeth faintly buzzing, your awareness sharpening rather than fading. You open your eyes to find the shopkeeper watching you expectantly. Better already, isn't it? You give a polite nod, the way one does when a relative asks if you like their experimental casserole. Leaving the shop, you think about the faith people put into these devices. No potions, no risky chemicals, just a belief that motion, sound, or mechanical ingenuity could trick the body into surrendering to sleep. Some of these contraptions, you suspect, might have actually lulled a person into rest. Others? Well, they might just have kept the insomniac awake, wondering if the gears were about to seize and fling them into the wall. And as you disappear back into the street's damp embrace, the faint hum of those machines still in your ears, you can't help but admire the Victorian optimism, their certainty that a little brass, a little wood, and a great deal of imagination could solve even the most stubborn case of the midnight mind. You follow the curve of the street until the mechanical hum of the previous block fades, replaced by a softer rhythm. Footsteps on thick carpet, the faint creak of a chair, and a voice, low, deliberate, impossibly slow, drifting through an open doorway. You slip into a candlelit parlor and find yourself among a small audience arranged in a neat semicircle. The room is warm, perfumed faintly with beeswax polish and a ghost of pipe tobacco. At the front, a man in a black frock coat dangles a gleaming pocket watch from a silver chain. It swings in a gentle arc, catching the light, the glint pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Your eyelids grow heavy, he says, each syllable stretched like taffy. The accent is hard to place, somewhere between London sophistication and a faint continental roll. This is no ordinary man with a watch. This is a mesmerist, here to demonstrate the wonders of animal magnetism and, naturally, its supposed ability to cure sleeplessness. You lean back in your chair, the candle flames winking in your peripheral vision. Mesmerism, named for Franz Mesmer, the 18th century physician who believed in invisible currents flowing through the body, had found a curious second life in Victorian England. Practitioners claimed they could realign your magnetic energy, hush your thoughts, and guide you into a deep, natural sleep. Some called it science. Others called it theater. Historians still argue whether mesmerism's effect lay in the body or purely in the power of suggestion. The mesmerist begins to pace, his free hand moving as if sculpting invisible clay around his subject. Tonight's volunteer, a pale young man in a burgundy velvet smoking jacket, sits perfectly still. His eyes are closed, his breathing shallow. The watch swings closer to his face, then away again, like a tide pulling and retreating. You are safe. The mesmerist murmurs, you are drifting. On a small side table rests an odd collection. A crystal sphere, a fan of peacock feathers, a silver tuning fork, and a shallow bowl of rose water. You're not sure if these are legitimate tools of the craft or props for dramatic flair. The Victorians adored a little spectacle after all, and the line between genuine therapy and stage performance was often thinner than the paper of a theater bill. The audience is hushed, their gazes locked on the hypnotic arc of the watch. Somewhere in the back, a woman suppresses a sneeze, perhaps from the incense smoldering in a brass censer near the hearth. You catch the faint clink of a teacup, the settling groan of a wooden floorboard. Whether the young man is truly sinking into a restorative trance or simply playing along, it's impossible to tell. His head tilts forward, his shoulders sag in surrender. The mesmerist pauses, looking pleased, and addresses the room. He explains, slowly, that restless minds can be lulled by the rhythmic focus of sight and sound. He speaks of nervous disorders, overwrought constitutions, and the dangerous overuse of patent sleeping draughts. Here, he insists, is a cure without chemical danger, no laudanum, no chloral hydrate, just the gentle redirection of the mind's attention until wakefulness crumbles. You picture a sleepless Victorian, perhaps a wealthy widow, paying dearly for a series of these sessions. Even if the trance did nothing physiologically, the experience, being in this dim, quiet room, eyes following the steady arc of a watch, with the low murmur of a confident voice, might be enough to nudge her into a night's rest. The placebo effect is still in effect. There's a curious little story whispered by the woman next to you. She claims a friend of hers, after a single mesmerist session, fell asleep for 14 uninterrupted hours and awoke, claiming she'd dreamt of an endless green meadow. Whether that's medical proof or an embellishment of memory, who can say? The demonstration continues. The mesmerist circles behind his subject, placing his hand lightly on the man's temples. His fingers make small, sweeping motions as though smoothing invisible creases in the air. The room smells faintly now of lavender oil. Perhaps it's been dabbed discreetly on the volunteer's neck to assist the process. You notice how every sensory element, sound, scent, sight, is calibrated to slow the mind. Finally, the mesmerist stands directly in front of the young man and, with a flourish, snaps his fingers. "Awake," he commands. The subject blinks rapidly, then smiles faintly, declaring that he feels light, as if a heavy coat has been removed. The audience breaks into polite applause, part appreciation, part relief that the volunteer didn't slump forward onto the floor. As the guests begin to rise and mingle, you remain seated, absorbing the lingering stillness in the air. The mesmerist glances toward you, raising an eyebrow as if to say, "Would you like to try?" You imagine taking that chair, the warm glow of the candles on your skin, the slow swing of the watch, the welcome temptation to surrender to someone else's voice. But outside, the cobblestones wait, along with the next oddity in the world of Victorian sleep cures. You stand, offering the mesmerist a small nod, and step back into the cool night. The rhythm of the watch still echoes faintly in your mind, comforting, strange, and just a little absurd. Another thread in this long, peculiar tapestry of how people once chased the promise of perfect sleep. You turn a corner and find yourself in a narrow lane that smells faintly of sweet herbs and damp wood. The cobblestones are slick from an earlier drizzle, and the reflection of gaslight shimmers faintly in the shallow puddles between stones. Overhead, lanterns sway gently in the night breeze, their glass panes fogged by the cool air, each one casting a soft halo that makes the shadows look deeper by contrast. Somewhere nearby, a cat yowls, then falls silent. A painted sign creaks above a half-open doorway. The Somnolent Society, members only. The letters are in faded gold leaf, flaking at the edges. Before you have time to second-guess yourself, you slip inside, letting the heavy oak door sigh shut behind you. The air within is dense and warm, heavy with steam and a perfume of valerian root, lemon balm, and something faintly medicinal. The walls are lined with tall shelves crammed with jars, hundreds of them, each filled with dried petals, twisted roots, curled cinnamon sticks, or mysterious powders labeled in looping script. In the middle of the room, a long oak table glows in the lamplight, covered in neat rows of glass vials and porcelain cups. A man with a wispy beard, spectacles slipping low on his nose, and ink-stained fingers gestures you closer. His name, he says, is Mr. Penworthy, compounder of the finest soporific cordials in London. The way he says it, you can't tell whether he's proud of the title or slightly embarrassed by its absurdity. He lifts a small glass vial sealed with red wax, holding it up so the light passes through the contents. Inside, the liquid is a deep amber, catching the glow like aged sherry. Valerian tincture, he says, the words rolling slowly as if each syllable is a precious thing. In Victorian England, valerian was both common and controversial, praised as nature's sedative by some, dismissed as an overrated weed by others. Historians still argue whether its effects were the result of genuine chemical compounds, or simply the persuasive power of ritual and expectation. Around the table, a dozen guests cradle tiny porcelain cups, sipping in slow, deliberate motions. You try a taste, sharp, bitter, with a faint echo of earth after rain. Not unpleasant, but not exactly something you'd pour for pleasure at a dinner party. The woman beside you leans in, her voice low, claiming it sends her into dreamless slumber within 20 minutes. A man across the table snorts and says it does nothing for him unless paired with a hot toddy. And a good mystery novel, the bloodier the better. Your eyes wander to a brass mortar and pestle in the corner, its surface permanently stained from decades of crushing roots. Next to it sits a copper kettle, steam curling lazily from its spout. Mr. Penworthy explains how each dose is prepared. Dried valerian boiled with lemon balm and chamomile, strained through fine linen, and fortified with a dash of brandy for medicinal warmth. You can't help thinking the brandy might be doing more heavy lifting than the herbs. In the far corner of the room, a small stage draped in velvet curtains features a single wooden chair. A young apothecary apprentice steps forward, hand steady, demonstrating how to prepare a laudanum-free nightcap. She moves with measured grace, as if each motion is part of a secret ceremony. Every scoop of dried petals sends a puff of scent into the air, sweet, sharp, occasionally with a musky undertone that makes you tilt your head in curiosity. The audience leans forward, eyes half-lidded, breathing it all in like a spell. Mr. Penworthy regales you with stories between sips. There's the tale of an eccentric patron who once insisted on mixing valerian with powdered pearl for extra refinement. The result? A shimmering drink that, by all accounts, did nothing but drain her purse and give her tea a strange metallic tang. Still, he says with a shrug, if she believed she'd sleep better, perhaps it worked in its own way. A shelf along the wall catches your eye. It's stacked with old pamphlets, their edges curled with age. You flip through one and find bold claims. Valerian, banisher of night terrors. Another promises that mixing it with warm milk will not only soothe the mind, but improve moral character. That last one makes you raise an eyebrow. No one here seems morally superior to the average Londoner, though they do seem better hydrated. The more you watch, the more you realize this place is less of a clinic and more of a club. These people aren't just here for the remedies. They're here for the ritual. They measure, pour, stir, and sip with a devotion usually reserved for religion, or at least for very good tea. In a city where laudanum shops stay open past midnight, the sight of people choosing bitter herbal brews instead feels oddly wholesome, even rebellious. A gentleman in a tweed coat leans over and asks if you've tried combining valerian with hops flowers. Gives it a sharper kick, he says, eyes bright. Another guest swears by a mixture of valerian and lettuce seed tea, which sounds suspiciously like drinking boiled salad. You nod politely, hiding your skepticism. As the evening winds on, conversations drift from remedies to dreams, to half-remembered ghost stories, to gossip about a certain aristocrat who supposedly spends half his fortune importing rare herbs from Egypt. You suspect at least half of these stories are invented on the spot, but they're entertaining enough to keep you lingering. Finally, as you make your way toward the exit, Mr. Penworthy presses another vial into your hand. On the house, he says with a faint smile, take it before bed. Think of something pleasant and let the rest take care of itself. Outside, the vial sits warm in your palm, the faint scent of valerian clinging to your fingers. The street is quiet now, the puddles reflecting the dim glow of lanterns, and you walk deeper into the night, feeling the strange pull of this city's endless cures. You follow the faint sound of laughter down another twisting alley, the cobblestones uneven under your boots. A fine mist has begun to fall, soft enough to bead on your coat without soaking through. Gas lights flicker behind foggy glass, their glow spilling onto the damp pavement in broken patches. Just ahead, you catch the warm scent of honey and baked bread drifting from an open cellar door. The sign above it reads, Dr. Whitcomb's Hypnotic Bakery. The painted letters curl in an almost whimsical script, the sort you might see on the cover of a children's book. Inside, the air is so warm and fragrant that stepping through the door feels like walking into an oven where someone has been baking dreams. Rows of golden loaves sit cooling on wooden racks. Their crusts crackle faintly as they cool, releasing bursts of aroma. Nutmeg, cinnamon, lavender. Yes, lavender. Here in Victorian London, the humble bakery isn't just a place to get your morning bread. Some have turned to the curious fashion of sleep loaves, bread infused with herbs and spices meant to lull you into slumber. Behind the counter, a tall man with a perfectly waxed mustache offers you a slice from a fresh loaf. The bread is soft, still steaming at its heart, the crumb flecked with tiny purple petals. Lavender and nutmeg, he says, my best seller for troubled sleepers. You take a bite. Sweet, floral, with a faint peppery edge from the nutmeg. He watches you chew, as if gauging whether you're already becoming drowsy. In the Victorian age, people were eager to try anything that might cure insomnia without resorting to laudanum or other harsh medicines. This gave rise to remedies disguised as comfort foods, biscuits laced with chamomile, puddings dusted with hops powder, and loaves like this one. Historians still argue whether these foods truly helped or if the warm, familiar act of eating bread before bed was enough to trick the mind into resting. The bakery itself hums with quiet energy. A woman in a blue dress sits by the window, tearing off small pieces of bread and dipping them into warm milk. Two older gentlemen at the corner table are in a lively debate about whether poppy seed cake is a respectable evening snack or an express ticket to moral decline. You can't help but smile. Victorians loved mixing health claims with moral judgments, as if the wrong dessert could somehow corrupt your soul. Behind the counter, Dr. Whitcomb moves with the confidence of a man who knows his craft. He explains that his recipes are inspired by ancient traditions. Egyptians, he claims, baked honey breads to honor sleep gods, while medieval monks used lavender loaves to calm anxious novices. Whether or not he's embellishing, the stories give the bread an almost ceremonial air. You wander toward the back of the shop, where sacks of flour are stacked neatly alongside jars of dried herbs. A small brick oven glows with faint embers, the fire low and steady. Here, the apprentices knead dough in slow rhythmic motions, as if their hands are moving to some invisible lullaby. The scent of rising bread mixes with the sharper note of fresh rosemary, and you catch yourself breathing deeper, letting it sink in. Dr. Whitcomb offers you another slice, this one darker, denser, with a faint bitterness beneath the sweetness. Valerian wheat loaf, he says. Not to everyone's taste, but it works. The texture is heavy, almost chewy, and leaves a lingering aftertaste like damp wood. You imagine eating a whole loaf might indeed slow you down enough to drift off, if only to escape the flavor. At the far end of the bakery, a notice board displays handwritten sleep schedules submitted by regular customers. One swears by eating lavender loaf at precisely 9:15 p.m., followed by 10 minutes of deep breathing. Another claims the key is to combine bread with a mug of milk infused with a single clove. You read them all, amused by how seriously people treat the timing of their nightly snacks. One story in particular stands out. A sailor who claimed he could sleep through even the roughest storms after eating a slice of poppy seed bread before bed. According to his note, it reminded him of home, the smell of his mother's kitchen, the warmth of the hearth, the faint hum of the wind outside. Maybe that's the real secret, you think. Not the ingredients, but the memories they carry. As you finish your slice, the bakery's door swings open, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. The room shivers for a moment, the warmth disturbed, then settles again. Outside, the mist has thickened into a fine rain, beading silver on the window glass. Dr. Whitcomb hands you a small paper bag. Inside, a neatly wrapped loaf, tied with string. On the house, he says with a wink, eat it warm and think pleasant thoughts. You step back into the night, the bread warm against your chest as you cradle it like a fragile treasure. The rain hisses softly on the cobblestones, and you follow the twisting alley onward, the scent of lavender and nutmeg lingering with every step, as if the city itself were trying to rock you to sleep. The rain eases as you turn onto a quieter street, where the gas lamps glow with a halo from the lingering mist. Here, the buildings lean inward slightly, their dark brick facades streaked with soot. The muffled clop of a distant carriage fades, replaced by a faint metallic chime, slow, steady, almost like a heartbeat. You follow the sound to a narrow doorway, over which hangs a brass sign etched with ornate flourishes. Professor Everhart's Sleep Mechanisms. Inside, the shop smells faintly of machine oil and cedar shavings, and the air is filled with the soft whir of gears. The room is cluttered in the most fascinating way. Shelves groaning under the weight of polished brass cogs, jars of springs, coils of copper wire, and strange glass bulbs that catch the lamplight. On a table in the center sits a collection of clockwork devices, each humming quietly. A tall man in a waistcoat, Professor Everhart himself, emerges from behind a curtain, spectacles perched low on his nose. "Ah," he says, with the air of someone expecting you, "you're here to see the somnochronometer." He gestures toward a gleaming contraption that looks like a marriage between a pocket watch and a miniature steam engine. Thin metal arms extend from its face, each tipped with a tiny bell. A faint, rhythmic clicking fills the air, so soft you almost don't notice it until you focus. Victorian insomnia remedies weren't always herbal or culinary. Some people believed mechanical rhythm itself could coax the brain into rest. Everhart explains that the somnochronometer is designed to entrain the mind, syncing your breathing and heartbeat to its gentle tick-tock. He winds it, and the sound changes, deepening into a low, resonant tock, tock, tock. You feel it in your chest more than you hear it. Historians still argue whether devices like this were genuinely effective or simply elaborate placebos. Some claim the slow rhythm activated the body's natural sleep cycle. Others thought it was just a glorified metronome. But in an era fascinated with both industry and the human mind, clockwork sleep aids seemed like the perfect blend of science and wonder. Everhart shows you other inventions. A dream oscillator that swings a weighted pendulum infused with scented oil, a hypnograph that traces your breathing patterns onto a paper scroll, and something he calls the night tortoise, a brass turtle whose shell slowly opens to release lavender vapors while it emits a low mechanical purr. The turtle, to your mild disappointment, does not walk. In one corner, a young apprentice is repairing a device shaped like a tiny cathedral, its steeple topped with a spinning star. When wound, the star rotates slowly, casting tiny pinpoints of light across the ceiling. The professor leans in, his voice softening. Many can't sleep because their minds are too busy. Give them something gentle to focus on, and the body will follow. The shop's walls are lined with testimonials, handwritten letters from customers swearing the devices changed their lives. One woman claims she went from 3 hours of restless sleep a night to 9 full hours after using the somnochronometer. A sea captain reports that his crew slept soundly even during storms, simply by placing the night tortoise in the galley. You suspect at least some of these tales are polished for effect. Still, there's a quiet magic here. The devices tick and hum like a chorus, each in its own tempo, yet somehow blending into a single hypnotic background. You imagine lying in bed with a somnochronometer at your side, its brass gleam catching the moonlight, its soft rhythm guiding you under. Everhart offers you a seat in a deep leather chair. He places the somnochronometer on a side table, winds it to a slower pace, and dims the lamps until the shop is lit only by the glow from the street outside. The ticking becomes the room's heartbeat. You close your eyes, and for a moment you feel your breathing settle into its rhythm. But just as you begin to sink into that calm, Everhart clears his throat and the spell breaks. "Unfortunately," he says, "this model is not for sale. It's my personal prototype." He hands you a smaller, plainer version, brass dulled with use. "Still works," he assures you, "if you treat it kindly." You tuck it into your coat pocket. The ticking is faint but constant, and as you step back into the damp street, it seems to merge with the sound of your footsteps. The mist has thinned now, revealing the faint outlines of taller buildings ahead. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell strikes the quarter hour. You keep walking. The somnochronometers beat in your pocket, the city's pulse around you, and the thought that maybe, just maybe, the Victorians were onto something when they decided to wind their way into sleep. You follow the fog-dampened street toward a wider boulevard, where the smells shift from rain and oil to something warmer. Bread, yeast, and a faint hint of nutmeg. The windows here are smaller, clouded with condensation, each one framing the inviting glow of gaslight. You pause outside a shop with a painted sign that reads, in looping gold letters, Mr. Beaumont's Restorative Bakery. Stepping inside is like stepping into another climate, dry, warm, and heavy with the scent of rising dough. The floor creaks under your boots, and your eyes adjust to a room lined with trays of biscuits, loaves, and small cakes. Behind the counter stands Mr. Beaumont himself, a man with flour dust in his beard and a waistcoat straining against a generous belly. You look like someone who hasn't slept in a week, he says cheerfully, as if diagnosing the weather. You've come to the right place. Victorian insomnia wasn't just a matter for chemists and engineers. It was also tackled by the bakers. Beaumont ushers you to a small table near the oven, explaining that he specializes in somnolent breads, recipes designed to nudge you toward slumber. Some are based on traditional nightcaps, others on medical theories of the day, and a few, well, those are his own proprietary blends. He brings out a loaf that looks ordinary enough, but when he slices into it, the air fills with the aroma of warm milk and honey. This one, he says, is infused with powdered lettuce seeds, supposed to quiet the nerves. You recall reading that lettuce in certain preparations was thought to have sedative properties. Historians still argue whether that was based on actual chemistry or simply the soporific reputation of lettuce leaves themselves. Beaumont pairs the bread with a small dish of almond paste. Almonds, he notes, were believed to restore balance to the humors, particularly the black bile, which they thought caused melancholy and sleeplessness. His tone suggests he knows the science is outdated, but he serves it with pride anyway. On another tray sits a row of golden biscuits dusted with sugar. He calls them moon biscuits, baked with chamomile tea instead of water, and rolled in ground poppy seeds. The first bite is crumbly, slightly floral with a nutty edge. You can see how someone, after a warm evening by the fire with a plate of these, might drift off more easily. Victorian bakers often worked from the same logic as apothecaries, only their remedies tasted far better. There were ginger loaves for warming the body on cold nights, milk puddings with grated nutmeg for soothing the stomach, and sweet buns laced with sleepy spices like mace and cinnamon. Beaumont even has a recipe book on display, pages yellowed and stained, where scribbled notes in the margins suggest constant tinkering. More nutmeg. Mrs. Jarvis swears by it. As you nibble another biscuit, he launches into a story about a gentleman who swore he could only sleep after eating a thick slice of Beaumont's saffron bread. He said it reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen, the baker says with a grin. Sometimes I think the cure is half in the taste, half in the memory it stirs up. That's a theme you've noticed tonight. These cures are rarely just about chemistry. They're rituals, sensory anchors, The act of winding a clockwork turtle or of sitting down to a warm slice of bread with honey tells the body it's time to rest. Beaumont offers you one last item, a small, dense cake wrapped in muslin. For later, he says, but don't eat the whole thing unless you plan to hibernate until spring. The cake smells faintly of lavender and something sharper, maybe brandy. He winks. A little nightcap in solid form. When you step back outside, the cool air hits you like a gentle slap, cutting through the bakery's warmth. The cake is tucked safely in your coat, and the faint scent of lavender follows you down the street. The boulevard curves away, leading toward a row of taller, more austere buildings, where the windows are shuttered tight against the night. Somewhere beyond them, you can hear faint music, the kind that drifts in and out of hearing like a dream you can't quite remember. Your footsteps crunch softly against scattered grit, and you realize the ticking of the somnochronometer in your pocket is still keeping time with your pace. Ahead, the music grows a little louder, a faint waltz played on something that might be a music box. You can't help but think the Victorians were as inventive with flavor as they were with gears, each cure as much about comfort as it was about science. And maybe, if you're lucky, tonight you'll get both. You follow that drifting waltz until it fades into the murmur of conversation, the shuffle of chairs, and the faint clink of glassware. The street opens into a narrow cul-de-sac where a sign sways gently on iron chains, the midnight parlor. Its lettering is painted in deep green with gilt edges, curling at the ends like ivy tendrils. Beneath the name is a smaller promise: rest for the restless. Inside, the air is dense with the mingled scents of herbs, candle wax, and the faint metallic tang of a brass samovar steaming in the corner. The place looks halfway between a tea room and an apothecary. Low tables are scattered across a space lit mostly by oil lamps, each fitted with shades that turn the light a honeyed gold. Shelves behind the counter are lined with jars, powders, roots, dried blossoms, and what look like curled strips of bark. A woman in a long indigo dress greets you with a voice that barely rises above the background murmur. "Welcome," she says. "We serve dreams here, liquid ones." You're seated at a small table by the window where condensation blurs the street outside into a watercolor haze. The menu is handwritten in looping script, each drink with a poetic name. Morpheus's milk, the lantern's lullaby, nightcap number 7. Alongside the names are small notations. Soothing, warming, good for overworked minds. Your hostess recommends Moonwater Cordial, a pale drink served warm in a delicate porcelain cup. It's made from distilled lemon balm, honey, and a dash of valerian root, a plant still debated by modern herbalists for its actual sedative effect. Historians still argue whether Victorians valued valerian more for its earthy taste or its supposed power to coax the mind into quietude. As you sip, the flavor is soft but lingering. Sweet at first, then a bitter undercurrent, like the moment before a candle gutters out. The warmth travels down your throat and spreads outward in a slow bloom. Around you, other patrons cradle similar cups, eyes half-lidded, shoulders unspooling their tension like thread from a spool. The parlor isn't just about drinks. Between tables, a man in a waistcoat passes quietly, carrying small parcels wrapped in paper, sleep sachets to tuck under pillows, each filled with lavender, hops, and dried rose petals. He sets one by your cup. The scent is heady and nostalgic, the kind that makes you think of summers you can't quite place in your own lifetime. From the corner, the music starts again. Not a waltz this time, but a slow wandering piece played on a glass harmonica. The sound is strange, almost unearthly, like wind over the mouth of a bottle, yet it feels oddly calming. You recall that in the 18th and 19th centuries, glass harmonicas were both celebrated for their ethereal beauty and feared for supposedly driving listeners to melancholy or madness. Whether that was due to the music itself or to lead in the glass, no one can quite agree. Your hostess returns with a small plate of pale biscuits dusted with something green. Lemon verbena sugar, she explains, for those who like their lullabies a little brighter. The biscuits crumble like sand, leaving behind a citrusy note that wakes the palate even as the rest of you feels heavier, slower. The midnight parlor has its own set of house rules posted discreetly near the door. No loud voices, no haggling, no clocks on the table. You imagine that last rule is meant to keep people from worrying about how much time they've lost here. Some customers may stay for hours, lulled not into sleep, but into a sort of waking drift, their thoughts unspooling into something softer than consciousness. Before you leave, the hostess tucks a folded scrap of paper into your palm. "A recipe?" she whispers. Unfolded, it reveals neat lines of ink describing how to make nightcap number 7. Heated milk, cinnamon stick, grated nutmeg, a spoonful of honey, and, surprisingly, a drop of laudanum. That last ingredient, she says with a knowing glance, is optional for the modern age. You step back into the damp night, the sachet tucked into your coat pocket, the warmth of the cordial lingering like an ember. The streets are quieter now. Somewhere behind you, the faint hum of the glass harmonica fades into the rain's gentle hiss. You think of all the small, deliberate rituals you've seen tonight. Drinks brewed slowly, scents bundled carefully, sounds chosen for their subtle pull. In a world obsessed with speed, the Victorians, for all their eccentricities, seemed to understand that slowness was part of the cure. You carry on through the rain-slick streets, your pace slowing as the glow of shop fronts gives way to the darker edges of the city. Here, the gas lamps burn fewer and farther between, their halos of light shrinking into islands in the mist. Cobblestones glisten like black glass, and the scent of damp earth rises from narrow alleys where water trickles toward unseen drains. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls, slow, deliberate, as if the hour itself were reluctant to arrive. Your path curves toward a building you might have missed, if not for the thin plume of smoke curling from a side chimney. A discreet wooden sign by the door reads, "Restorium for those who cannot rest." You push the door open and are met with a puff of warm herbal air. Inside, the space feels more like a physician's drawing room than a public hall. Polished wood floors, a crackling fire in the hearth, and an arrangement of armchairs upholstered in deep green velvet. An elderly gentleman in a dark waistcoat greets you without rising from his desk. His voice is precise, each word clipped like a sprig of mint. "You're here for the consultation?" he asks, though it sounds more like a statement than a question. You are guided to a chair beside a low table, where a porcelain teapot steams gently beside a brass mortar and pestle. Shelves along the wall are filled with glass apothecary jars, each labeled in looping handwriting. Chamomile blossoms, passion flower, skullcap, ashwagandha. In the far corner, A peculiar contraption hums quietly, a Victorian inhaler designed to turn herbal infusions into fragrant vapor. Historians still argue whether such inhalers were genuinely effective for insomnia or simply theatrical devices meant to impress paying customers. The gentleman, Dr. Wexley, as you gather from the small brass nameplate on the desk, asks you about your sleep troubles in the way one might inquire about the weather. He nods knowingly at each answer, scribbling notes in a leather-bound ledger. The mind, he remarks, is like a restless dog. It must be coaxed to lie down, not commanded. He demonstrates a preparation method. A pinch of dried passion flower crushed gently with lemon balm leaves, then steeped in water just below boiling. Into this, he stirs a spoonful of dark syrup that smells faintly of molasses and licorice root. This, he explains, is black treacle infused with valerian, a remedy favored by both poets and sailors. You recall reading that valerian was sometimes called nature's Valium, though the Victorians would never have used the term. Your cup is placed before you, and the first sip is like drinking the shadow of a meadow, grassy, slightly bitter, yet strangely comforting. As the warmth settles in, Dr. Wexley retrieves a small wooden box and opens it to reveal smooth stones, polished to a muted sheen. "Worry stones," he says. "Rub one between your fingers for 20 minutes before bed." Some say it draws out the anxious thoughts. In the corner, a woman sits beneath a tall, narrow frame draped with black cloth. Curious, you watch as she adjusts the cloth over her head, breathing deeply in the warm vapor from the inhaler. The scent reaches you, eucalyptus and chamomile, with a faint metallic tang from the brass fittings. It's almost pleasant, though you suspect the steam might do more for her sinuses than her dreams. Dr. Wexley shares a story about a patient who claimed never to have slept more than 2 hours a night for 20 years. The solution, he says with a sly smile, was not a medicine at all, but a nightly ritual. Precisely 30 brush strokes through the hair, followed by reciting a line from Tennyson until the words blurred into nothingness. Whether this was the cure or the patient's belief in it, he leaves unsaid. On the mantel, you notice a curious framed print, a sleeping figure surrounded by swirling shapes, plants, stars, and indistinct creatures, rendered in soft, fading ink. Dream chart, he explains, a Victorian attempt to map the contents of the unconscious. Some believed you could train the mind to visit the same dream repeatedly, like returning to a favorite inn. Your consultation ends with the doctor pressing a small paper packet into your hand. Inside are dried petals, the color of pale sunlight. "Marigold," he says. "Steep it, drink it, then place the spent flowers beneath your pillow. You might dream of someone you have not seen in a very long time." You step back out into the mist with the faint taste of herbs lingering on your tongue and the smooth worry stone in your pocket. The street feels quieter now, as though the city itself has curled up and pulled a blanket over its head. You can't tell if it's the tea or the firelight still warming you from the inside, but your footsteps seem slower, your shoulders lighter. The rain begins again. Not the sharp patter of a downpour, but the gentle kind that blurs the edges of buildings and turns lamplight into golden halos. Somewhere behind you, the Restorium's door closes softly, sealing in its warmth and whispers, and you walk on deeper into the night. You wander further from the well-lit streets, following a faint music that seems to hover in the fog like a dream you almost remember. At first, you think it might be someone practicing the violin in a distant flat, but as you turn a corner, the sound sharpens. Soft harp strings plucked in slow, deliberate rhythm. It's coming from an upstairs window of a narrow brick building with peeling paint and ivy curling along the gutters. A wooden placard above the door reads, "Somnus Club, members only." You hesitate, but the door swings open on its own, revealing a dimly lit staircase. The air smells of beeswax, lavender, and something faintly medicinal. You climb, each step muffled by thick carpeting, until you reach a wide salon bathed in amber lamplight. Inside, half a dozen people lounge on chaise longues draped in patterned throws. They wear soft slippers and pale dressing gowns, some with blindfolds tied loosely over their eyes. A young woman in a silk robe glides between them, carrying a tray of tiny porcelain cups filled with steaming milk infused with nutmeg. The harp music comes from a corner where a man with silver hair plays with his eyes closed, his fingers barely brushing the strings. One of the club members, a cheerful gentleman with an accent you can't quite place, beckons you to join him. "First visit?" he asks, before explaining that the Somnus Club is a private society for those who treat insomnia not as an affliction, but as an art form. "We believe in crafting the perfect descent into sleep," he says, "like painting the final brushstroke on a masterpiece." He tells you that the club was founded in the 1870s by a retired sea captain who could never adjust to the stillness of land after decades of rocking ships and ocean winds. His cure, so he claimed, was to recreate the exact sensory environment of a ship's cabin: the creak of ropes, the distant hush of waves, even the smell of tarred wood. Tonight, the theme is gentle forest. You notice that the club members are surrounded by subtle illusions. The lamplight flickers through green-tinted glass to mimic sunlight through leaves. Faint, recorded bird calls play from a brass phonograph in the corner, and a delicate grassy scent drifts from a hidden burner. Historians still argue whether such sensory immersion clubs were eccentric indulgences or early examples of environmental therapy. The hostess offers you a seat and places a warm, bean-filled pouch across your shoulders. The weight presses down like a comforting hand, and the faint aroma of rosemary and sage rises from the fabric. She whispers, "Focus only on the sound of the harp," before slipping away. The music slows, each note spaced wider apart, as though the player is stretching time itself. You notice your breathing deepen without conscious effort, your eyes half closing. The gentleman beside you begins telling a story about a friend who swore by a bizarre nightly ritual, lying on the floor in total darkness while a metronome clicked exactly 60 times per minute. According to him, it never failed to bring on sleep, though guests in his home found it deeply unsettling. On a low shelf, you spot a curious collection: small glass spheres filled with liquid of varying shades: pale blue, warm amber, cloudy white. "Mood orbs," the hostess explains when she returns. "Victorian novelty. You hold one, and the temperature of the liquid supposedly reveals your mental state. Cool for calm, warm for restlessness. We think it's just your body heat, but people like the ritual. You take one of the pale blue orbs in your hand. It remains cool, though you're not sure if that's a good sign. Around you, club members are slipping into various stages of drowsiness. Some curled on their sides under woolen blankets, others reclining with faint smiles. A brass clock on the wall chimes softly, 3 notes, low and slow. The harp music fades, replaced by the sound of rain recorded onto a wax cylinder. It's uncanny, the way the hiss and patter seem to wrap around the room. You realize you've been here for nearly an hour, though it feels like a drifting, timeless space where no one is in a hurry. When you finally stand to leave, the hostess presses a folded paper into your hand. On it is a handwritten list of sleep phrases in flowing copperplate. Short, soothing sentences meant to be whispered to oneself before bed. One reads, "The tide is rising, the lantern is low." Another, "The forest holds you in its quiet arms." She tells you to repeat one 3 times each night, in the same tone you'd use to speak to a restless child. Back outside, the city feels just a bit emptier without the harp's gentle pull. The fog curls low over the street, catching on lamplight in soft halos. In your pocket, the paper feels oddly warm, as though it's carried a trace of the Somnus Club's heat into the cool night. Your steps are slower now, and you find yourself listening for the faintest threads of music in the silence, wondering if they might draw you somewhere else entirely. You keep walking, the cobblestones slick beneath your shoes, when a faint, buttery glow leaks from the seams of a wooden cellar door. The hinges complain as you pull it open, and a warm, herbal-scented breath escapes into the night. It's the sort of smell that makes you feel instantly both hungrier and sleepier. Lavender laced with honey, chamomile softened by something earthy and deep. You duck your head and descend the narrow staircase. Each step dips slightly in the middle, worn smooth by a century of feet. The air thickens as you go down, warmer, heavier, like a blanket settling over your shoulders. At the bottom, you step into a small, low-ceilinged room lit by beeswax candles. The walls are lined with shelves sagging under the weight of glass jars, their contents floating in amber, gold, tea-brown, or moss-green liquid. At the center sits an elderly man in a tweed waistcoat, hunched over a heavy oak table. He's using a brass scale to weigh what looks like tiny curled petals. Without looking up, he says in a voice as smooth as poured syrup, "You've come for the moon, honey, haven't you?" You don't answer right away because you're busy taking in the sight. Labels written in a careful looping hand, jars sealed with beeswax and string, bundles of drying herbs hanging from the beams above. The air tastes faintly sweet, as though every breath carries a ghost of sugar. He gestures to a short, squat bottle beside him. The liquid inside is golden and thick, catching candlelight in slow, heavy ripples. "Victorian moon syrup," he says, tapping the glass. "My great-grandmother swore it could calm even the most stubborn mind. Honey infused with lavender, lemon balm, and just a whisper of valerian root. The Victorians treated sleeplessness like a mystery to be coaxed, not beaten. You remember reading somewhere that honey before bed can stabilize blood sugar and trick your body into thinking it's safe to relax?" He shrugs when you mention this. "Maybe so," he says. "Or maybe it's the ritual, the slow stir, the gentle sip, the way the sweetness lingers." Historians still argue whether Victorian cures worked through chemistry or comfort, and perhaps that's the point. He pours a spoonful into a porcelain cup for you to taste. It blooms on your tongue. First the floral lavender, then the citrusy whisper of lemon balm, then the deep, almost woody sigh of valerian. For a second, you imagine yourself in a lamplit kitchen in 1893, the wind tapping the window, the syrup's warmth spreading through your chest like a small contained fire. Of course, he says, turning back to his table, not every syrup was safe. Laudanum found its way into plenty of sleep tonics, opium dissolved in alcohol, strong enough to quiet both mind and body permanently if you weren't careful. He opens a drawer and removes a battered recipe book, its pages stained and curling at the edges. One entry, written in cramped, shaky script, reads, "For nights when the stars will not leave you alone." Beneath, it calls for poppy petals, cloves, and something called night mint. You ask what that is. He smiles, clearly pleased you noticed. A rare herb from the Scottish Highlands. Leaves cool the tongue as though you've just sipped from a mountain stream. Not easy to grow this far south. Behind him, a pendulum clock ticks steadily, its rhythm blending with the faint crackle of candle wicks. Some kept clocks like this by their bed, he says, not to count hours, but to muffle them. A steady tick becomes a rope you climb down into sleep. On one shelf, you notice the jars aren't sorted by plant or color, but by mood. Soft quiet, slow drift, heavy heart, untethered mind. You ask about the last one. He chuckles. For dreamers who can't land their thoughts, keeps the mind from floating off entirely. He offers you a darker syrup next, nearly black, with the sheen of polished ink. It smells faintly of molasses and violets. Sailor's Blend, he explains. Recipe from a man who claimed it could pull the moon down to your pillow. Whether that's a blessing or a threat, I leave to you. You taste it, sweet at first, then a slow bloom of bitterness, like chewing on a forbidden flower. You picture Victorian kitchens at midnight, a single oil lamp glowing, shadows leaning long across the walls as someone stirs syrup in a pan, steam ghosting upward. A cat slips between their ankles. The outside world is muffled by fog, by distance, by time itself. Inside, the insomniac pours the thick liquid into a cup and drinks slowly, as though savoring not just the taste, but the act of stopping for it. The apothecary wraps a small jar for you in brown paper, tying it with a bit of twine. A teaspoon before bed, he advises, and another if you wake before dawn. But don't chase sleep too hard. She prefers to be courted, not caught. When you step back into the street, the jar feels warm in your coat pocket, as though it's storing the last of the shop's candlelight. You imagine yourself later, spoon in hand, the syrup sliding slow and heavy over your tongue, each swallow pulling you one notch closer to the edge of dreams. Whether it works or not hardly matters. Sometimes the promise is the cure. And as you walk on, you wonder how many more cures, tucked behind unmarked doors and narrow staircases, are still waiting to be found tonight. You follow the curling lane until the houses grow fewer, the lamplight patchier, and the air sharper against your cheeks. Somewhere far ahead, a lantern swings gently from a wooden post, marking the entrance to a garden gate so narrow you almost miss it. The hinges sigh when you push it open, and immediately you're greeted by the layered perfume of night-blooming flowers. Jasmine like soft cream, honeysuckle with its sugar-laced edge, and something deeper, almost peppery, that you can't quite name. The path winds through low hedges toward a glass house. Its panes glisten in the moonlight, and condensation beads down in rivulets, blurring the shapes inside. You hear the faint chime of running water, and when you step in, the warmth is like walking into a slow exhale. An elderly woman in a moss-green shawl, is tending to a bed of silvery plants, their leaves catching the light like small mirrors. "You look like someone who hasn't been sleeping," she says, not unkindly. Her voice is the sort you want to bottle, low, steady, and faintly amused. She waves you over to a workbench where bundles of herbs hang upside down, each tagged with hand-lettered names: skullcap, passion flower, blue vervain. The Victorians, she says, treated gardens as medicine cabinets, not just for the body, but for the mind. A well-tended patch of green could work as a sedative long before the tea ever touched your lips. She pulls a faded notebook toward you, its cover smelling faintly of pressed leaves. Inside, neat rows of notes describe sleep bouquets, arrangements of certain flowers meant to be placed by the bedside. You run your finger down a recipe dated 1878, lavender, chamomile, and something called moonwort. The entry claims moonwort opens the mind to dreams and closes it against waking worries. Historians still argue whether moonwort was a real plant or just a poetic invention, but she seems entirely convinced. In the far corner, a fountain burbles gently, the water trickling over smooth stones. Some Victorians kept little tabletop fountains, she says, believing the sound slowed the pulse. It's hard to think about tomorrow when your mind is sinking with water. You close your eyes for a moment, and she's right. The noise is like the earth's own breathing. She hands you a ceramic mug of steaming brew, pale green and lightly fragrant. The first sip is grassy and warm, the second deeper, like an embrace you didn't know you needed. The woman watches you with a small smile. Passion flower. It doesn't force you to sleep, it just moves the walls a little farther away so you can breathe. Nearby, an old phonograph spins something slow and wistful, the needle crackling. Music was its own cure, she adds. Not loud, not complex, just a melody repeated enough that it became part of the room. Like a lullaby you half remember from childhood. You wander between the beds, brushing your fingertips over leaves cool with condensation. In one corner, she's placed small wicker chairs, facing a cluster of white lilies. For midnight conversations, she explains, sometimes what you need isn't a tincture or tea. It's a listener. The thought sticks with you. Maybe the Victorians knew that loneliness could be as sleepless as caffeine. When it's time to leave, she presses a small paper packet into your palm. Seeds, she says. Grow them. Watch them. That's the real medicine, slowing yourself down to match the pace of something that doesn't rush. Stepping back into the cool night, you tuck the seeds safely into your pocket. Behind you, the glass house glows faintly, a lantern for the lost and restless. Ahead, the road bends toward whatever dreams you've been chasing. You don't hurry. Tonight, even your footsteps feel drowsy. Word count 1042. Wind down 300 words. The road narrows, the cobblestones giving way to soft earth, and the last hints of lamplight fade behind you. Overhead, the stars scatter themselves lazily across the sky, no longer sharp pinpricks, but gentle smudges in the hazy dark. You breathe in, slowly, and the air tastes faintly of the herbs you've carried with you. Lavender, honey, a memory of something green. You let your shoulders sink. The night is no longer something to be fought through. It's become a soft quilt draped over the edges of the world. Each sound is smaller now. A far-off owl's muted call, the rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze that doesn't bother to hurry, Even your own footsteps seem to pad along in time with your breath, slower, quieter, until they are less walking than drifting. In the distance, a warm square of light glows from a lone cottage window. You imagine stepping inside, finding a chair by the fire, a mug of something steaming, the murmured comfort of a voice telling you you're safe, you're home, you can rest, and maybe, in some unseen way, that's exactly where you are now. The stories you've heard tonight of syrups, gardens, whispered remedies settle like dust in a sunbeam, drifting down into the corners of your mind. They blur at the edges, melting into one another until they are simply part of the room inside your head where sleep comes to visit. And as your eyes grow heavy, the thought lingers. Perhaps the Victorians understood something we still forget, that rest is not something we seize, but something that arrives when we finally stop trying to hold on so tightly. If you're still awake, don't worry. We'll be right here with you tonight, and together we'll drift into our second story, which begins not in some dusty Victorian bedroom, but under a silvered sky, in the middle of a midnight garden. The air is cool, damp with dew, and your shoes sink ever so slightly into the soft soil as you wander past hedges clipped into shapes that look suspiciously like sleeping cats. This isn't just any garden. It's a carefully curated apothecary of insomnia cures, every plant chosen for its alleged ability to lull you toward oblivion. You can smell the lavender first, its sweet herbal perfume floating on the breeze like the faintest whisper, coaxing your eyelids lower. Victorians adored their medicinal gardens. In cities, wealthy homeowners cultivated little patches in their backyards, while countryside estates had sprawling grounds where moonlight pooled between rows of valerian, chamomile, and passion flower. Valerian, in particular, was the darling of the era. Its roots were harvested, dried, and brewed into a tea so pungent it could knock out a horse, or so they claimed. You crouch near a bed of it now, noting its feathery leaves and white blooms that look deceptively innocent. The truth? The smell, once processed, is somewhere between stale socks and a barnyard. But Victorians swore by it. Here's the quirky part. Some believe that merely walking among these plants at night, breathing in the mingled scents, could be enough to reset your body clock. One eccentric London physician even advertised moonlit strolls as a medical service, claiming the combination of silver light, dew, and herbal fragrance worked better than any pill. Historians still argue whether he was a visionary or just a clever marketer trying to charge patients for a walk in his own back garden. You pause at a row of tall, spindly stalks, angelica, their pale umbels glowing in the dark like miniature moons. In Victorian folk belief, angelica was thought to drive away evil spirits and bad dreams. One gardener's diary from 1874 describes tying bunches of it above bedroom doors, not for fragrance, but as a guardian against restless mind and unwelcome phantoms. You imagine a visitor stepping into such a room and immediately confronting the sight of drying plants dangling overhead, their stalks rustling faintly in the draft. Comforting or creepy? Depends on how badly you want to sleep. Some parts of the garden seem designed for more experimental therapy. A shaded alcove reveals a wrought iron bench, its seat warmed by an odd little brazier tucked beneath. The idea, apparently, was to keep the body toasty while the mind was soothed by the garden's ambience. A hostess might seat her sleepless guests there, wrapping them in shawls and instructing them to breathe the night air until calm descends. You settle in for a moment, and the combination of warmth against your legs and cool breeze on your face is surprisingly pleasant, like being in two climates at once. The Victorians didn't shy away from mixing science with superstition. For example, in one corner of the garden stands a tiny gazebo, its ceiling lined with mirrors angled to catch moonlight and concentrate it onto a table below. The table is littered with small bowls of herbs, crushed hops, mint, lemon balm. The belief was that the moonlight would activate the sleeping properties of these plants. A quaint idea, though you suspect it had more to do with creating a ritual, a moment of focus before bedtime. Modern sleep therapists might call that sleep hygiene, though without the mirrors and dramatic lighting. From time to time, you hear the crunch of gravel. Another nocturnal visitor? Perhaps one of those Insomniac Society members from Section 11 of our last journey still making their rounds. There's a gentle absurdity to it. People pacing in formal attire at 1 a.m., stopping to sniff a sprig of lavender, muttering polite conversation about the weather, and pretending not to notice they're all just here because their minds refuse to turn off. Of course, there were failures. Some Victorians planted exotic herbs imported at great expense, only to discover they had no sedative effect whatsoever. Or worse, they were mildly stimulating. Imagine the disappointment of brewing a rare Ceylon leaf infusion and realizing it made you want to reorganize your pantry at midnight. One notorious case involved a certain Lord Bracknell, who commissioned an entire sleep grove of imported plants from South America. Within weeks, guests were reporting vivid dreams, bouts of dizziness, and in one alarming case, uncontrollable giggling at 3 a.m. The grove was quietly uprooted. As you move deeper into the garden, the scents shift, now more resinous, spicy. Rosemary, though usually associated with memory, was sometimes used in small amounts to clear the mind of clutter. The theory was that too many thoughts, like books stacked haphazardly, kept the brain awake. Rosemary tea, in moderation, might tidy the mental shelves. Of course, in excess, it could also cause palpitations. Victorian insomnia cures often walk this razor's edge between soothing and overstimulating, a bit like drinking coffee because you think it will calm your nerves. At the far end of the garden, you find the night-blooming cereus, a rare cactus that only flowers after dark, releasing an intoxicatingly sweet scent. For Victorians, catching it in bloom was an event. They'd invite friends over at midnight to witness it, believing that the sight alone could soothe a restless heart. Standing here, you can almost understand the appeal. The flower is luminous, fragile, and utterly silent, as if it knows the importance of not disturbing the night. Eventually, you make your way back toward the wrought iron gate, the gravel path crunching softly underfoot. You've breathed in lavender, valerian, rosemary, and a touch of night-blooming magic. Whether any of it truly works is still up for debate, but the sensory experience, cool air, warm bench, shimmering moonlight, has a calming effect that no historian would deny. And maybe, just maybe, that's all an insomniac ever really needed. If the midnight garden was all about subtlety, whispers of scent, moonlight rituals, our next Victorian remedy has all the subtlety of a brass band. The opium-laced bedtime tea. This was the era after all, when the dividing line between medicine and poison was drawn in pencil and often erased entirely if someone thought a pinch more would really do the trick. Picture a genteel London drawing room in the 1880s. The hostess, concerned for her guests' nerves, gestures toward a polished mahogany tea cart. The china teapot is already steaming, its aroma a curious blend of chamomile, lemon peel, and just the faintest earthy bitterness. The secret? A tincture of laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, dripped discreetly into the pot before serving. The hostess calls it night tea. The guests call it miraculous. The pharmacist, meanwhile, calls it sixpence a dram and doesn't ask too many questions. Victorians adored their opium not only for pain relief, but for soothing anxiety, quieting coughing fits, and, crucially, knocking a restless mind straight into oblivion. In small amounts, laudanum gave the drinker a warm, floaty sensation, the mental equivalent of a heavy quilt on a winter's night. In larger amounts, well, let's just say the line between deep sleep and never waking up could get uncomfortably thin. Recipes for bedtime tea varied. One popular version combined valerian root for its sedative qualities. Hops, yes, the beer ingredient, also thought to encourage drowsiness. Lemon balm, and a few drops of laudanum. Another skipped the herbs entirely and simply added the tincture to whatever tea was on hand. Earl Grey, peppermint, even plain hot water. The more imaginative households would sweeten the brew with honey and a dash of nutmeg, claiming the spice opened the pathways of the mind to gentle dreams. More likely, it masked the medicinal taste of opium. Of course, the whole enterprise had a distinctly dangerous edge. Medical journals of the time occasionally printed stern warnings about the habitual use of soporific teas, often couched in language that suggested the writers knew very well nobody was going to stop. Some physicians argued that reliance on such mixtures led to opium sleep, a state that wasn't truly restorative, leaving the patient groggy and dependent. But try telling that to someone who'd been awake for 3 nights straight, pacing their carpet thin. Not all opium teas were made at home. In major cities there were night houses, late-hour tea shops catering to insomniacs, anxious writers, overworked clerks, and anyone else who found themselves restless after dark. For a modest fee, you could sip a steaming cup while listening to the low murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of a spoon, and the rhythmic hiss of the kettle. Proprietors insisted their brews were perfectly safe, though a few were quietly shut down after suspiciously high numbers of patrons began returning night after night, looking progressively more glazed. One famous case involved a certain Mr. Edwin Harcourt, a minor poet with major sleep troubles. Harcourt became so enamored with a particular opium-laced blend from a Fleet Street night house that he started ordering it by the gallon. Within months, friends reported he could fall asleep anywhere, at the theater, in the middle of a conversation, even once while crossing the street. Mercifully, traffic then was slower. His eventual recovery required both medical intervention and a determined housekeeper who replaced his stash with plain chamomile. Harcourt claimed he could taste the difference in his very bones, but conceded it was probably for the best. There was also a cultural romance around these teas. In certain circles, taking a small dose before bed was seen as a genteel indulgence, akin to a glass of port. Novels of the period even hinted at moonlit conversations over steaming cups. Where secrets were shared and hearts unburdened, the laudanum, lending a soft blur to the edges of reality. If a character drifted into sleep mid-sentence, it was taken as a sign that the remedy had worked its magic. The dangers, though, were undeniable. Tolerance could build quickly, leading users to add just a drop more each night. Accidental overdoses weren't rare, and the line between therapeutic and lethal was alarmingly narrow. By the end of the century, growing public concern and a few too many tragic headlines led to tighter regulations. Laudanum remained available, but its association with genteel bedtime rituals began to fade, replaced by milder, less risky sedatives. Still, the image of that quiet drawing room persists. The soft lamplight, the fragrant steam curling upward, the faint, drowsy smile of someone finally surrendering to sleep. Whether it was the herbs, the opium, or simply the ritual itself, the Victorians knew how to make bedtime feel like a small, luxurious ceremony. And if you ignore the toxic, addictive part, well, it almost sounds inviting. From the potent and perfumed to the downright peculiar, let's wander into one of the more eccentric corners of Victorian sleep science, the electrical sleep helmet. Yes, you heard that right. Somewhere between a piece of medical equipment and a failed steampunk fashion statement. This device promised to send gentle currents through your head to lull your brain into rest. You picture it now, a contraption of polished brass, leather straps, and curious wires sprouting like the feelers of a mechanical insect. It sits on the dressing table beside a stack of moral improvement books and a bottle of lavender water. Its inventor, perhaps a gentleman with a shock of uncombed hair and a twinkle of mad genius, swears the currents mimic the brain's own sleeping waves. The idea? To nudge your nervous system toward that blissful oblivion. Electricity was a Victorian obsession. After all, here was an invisible force that could light a room, move a train, and apparently cure your sleeplessness. Physicians experimented with galvanic therapy, attaching electrodes to various body parts in the belief that a mild shock could stimulate healing. For insomniacs, the helmet was the logical next step. Focus the current on the seat of consciousness, and surely you could switch it off like a lamp. The helmets came in variations. Some resembled metal crowns, others a full leather cap lined with conductive plates. You'd slip it on, fasten the chin strap, and connect it to a small battery, sometimes operated by hand crank, other times by chemical cells that fizzed softly as they worked. A faint tingle would creep across your scalp, accompanied by the gentle hum of electrical resistance. In theory, you'd feel drowsy within minutes. In practice, well, some users reported deep, restorative sleep, while others ended up wide-eyed with static, flattened hair and a mild headache. One fringe account, though historians still argue whether it's true, involves a lady from Bath who insisted on wearing her electrical sleep helmet to bed every night for 6 months. She claimed it not only cured her insomnia, but also gave her unusually vivid dreams involving moonlit voyages and conversations with historical figures. Her skeptical nephew suggested the dreams might have been less supernatural and more the result of occasional mild electrocution. Quackery and innovation danced close together in those days. While some doctors genuinely believed in the therapeutic value of controlled electrical stimulation, others saw the helmet as a fashionable novelty for the wealthy, a kind of conversation piece to impress dinner guests. Imagine being shown into a parlor and offered sherry, while the host proudly demonstrated the latest marvel of the age by giving you a quick zap. And then there were the mail-order versions advertised in the backs of periodicals alongside snake oil tonics and miracle corsets. These promised safe, soothing slumber without drugs, and came with vague diagrams showing happy sleepers wearing what looked like gilded torture devices. The fine print warned users not to operate the helmet near water or during thunderstorms, a safety tip that raises far too many questions. Despite the oddity, there's a certain charm in the optimism behind these devices. The Victorians were exploring uncharted territory, convinced that science could master the mysteries of the mind as easily as it tamed steam and steel. In a way, the helmet was less about the zap itself and more about the ritual. Strapping it on, feeling that faint buzz, and believing, really believing, that sleep was just a switch away. Eventually, the fad fizzled. Advances in neurology showed that the brain's sleep patterns were far more complex than a simple on-off circuit, and public taste shifted toward less alarming bedtime aids. But the electrical sleep helmet remains a curious relic, a reminder that the path to a good night's rest has always been paved with equal parts hope, ingenuity, and a dash of absurdity. And as you picture that contraption gleaming in lamplight, you can't help but wonder, if someone handed it to you tonight, would you try it? Just one gentle current across your temples, a promise of dreams delivered on a whisper of voltage. If the electrical sleep helmet sounded like a delicate experiment in modern science, then the next Victorian invention feels more like stepping into a magician's workshop, the mechanical rocking bed. You might think of it as a cradle for adults, though Victorians would probably insist it was a precision-engineered oscillatory sleep apparatus. Same thing, really. Picture this: a sturdy wooden frame fitted with hidden gears, pulleys, and counterweights, all designed to sway you back and forth in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Some models used a hand crank that your obliging spouse could turn until you drifted off. Others relied on clockwork mechanisms that ticked softly in the darkness, rocking the bed for an hour or more before winding down. The wealthy could even afford steam-powered versions, though, frankly, nothing says restful night quite like the hiss of boiling water next to your pillow. Rocking to sleep wasn't a new idea. Nurses had soothed babies this way for centuries, and sailors often claimed that life aboard a gently moving ship gave them the deepest rest of all. The Victorian twist was to mechanize it, to bring the lulling sway indoors and make it available on demand. For insomniacs, this promised a return to the earliest, most primal comfort, the feeling of being rocked into safety. One particularly famous model was the somno-motion bed, advertised as the surest balm for the weary mind. The sales pamphlet featured engravings of respectable couples dozing blissfully while their mechanical cradle hummed along. The mechanism could be adjusted for different speeds, slow and steady for peaceful nights, or a slightly brisker sway to refresh the spirit after a taxing day. The fact that the latter setting often left sleepers dizzy in the morning was considered a minor inconvenience, a quirky historical tidbit. In 1883, a London newspaper ran a story about a gentleman who became so dependent on his rocking bed that he had it installed in his railway sleeping car for a cross-country trip. According to the piece, though historians still argue whether it's just Victorian humor, he refused to board until the railway company agreed to bolt the contraption to the carriage floor, insisting that without it, he'd be as restless as a cat in a rain barrel. Of course, the rocking bed wasn't without risks. If the gears jammed mid-sway, you might find yourself tilted at an awkward angle until someone came to reset the mechanism. And then there was the issue of noise, especially in cheaper models. Instead of a gentle creak, you might get a rhythmic metallic clunk every few seconds, turning the bed into more of a sleep deterrent than a cure. Still, there's something undeniably comforting in the thought of such a bed. You lie there, feeling the slow push and pull, your body swaying in time with the faint mechanical heartbeat beneath you. The lamplight flickers on the wall, shadows sliding gently like a dream already forming. You don't have to think about sleeping. The bed is doing the work for you. Perhaps the real magic of the rocking bed wasn't its mechanical ingenuity, but the way it tapped into memory, into that half-forgotten sensation of being cradled without a care in the world. For all the noise and occasional hiccups, the Victorians who swore by them believed they were buying more than rest. They were buying a piece of childhood, carefully reconstructed in mahogany and brass. And who knows, if someone offered you one tonight, would you climb in, wind up the gears, and let yourself be carried away? Just you, the creak of the frame, and the slow, certain rhythm that promises to carry you to dreams. If you thought the mechanical rocking bed was peak Victorian ingenuity, wait until you hear about the hypnotic lantern. Not a carnival trick, not a magician's sleight of hand, though it certainly looked the part, but a serious, store-bought insomnia cure that found its way into parlors, bedrooms, and even a few luxury train compartments. Imagine, if you will, a softly glowing oil lamp, not casting a steady beam, but coaxing your room into a slow dance of light and shadow. The flame, shielded and refracted through clever mechanics, would project drifting shapes and patterns onto the ceiling and walls. Some lanterns were humble, a simple cut metal shade rotating lazily on the heat rising from the lamp, scattering the room with a gentle dapple of moving light, like ripples on a pond at sunset. Others were works of art, glass cylinders painted with moonlit hills, night skies scattered with stars, or pastoral scenes of grazing sheep. The motion was hypnotic, unhurried, as if the very room itself had decided to breathe more slowly. The most coveted model bore the grand name Somnoscope. Marketed as a balm for the mind's disquiet, it came in a polished mahogany case with brass fittings and allowed you to adjust the rotation speed with a tiny lever. Faster, and the shadows waltzed. Slower, and they barely drifted, as though suspended in honey. Advertisements promised the Somnoscope would draw the mind's eye away from troublesome thoughts, a claim just as appealing in the 1890s as it would be in our era of midnight doom scrolling. One charming fringe detail, in 1897, a Scottish inventor filed a patent for a narrative lantern, whose rotating panels told a short, wordless bedtime story in silhouette. Tiny Victorian shadow theater in your own bedroom. Historians still argue whether it ever made it to production, but if it did, it would have been the analog ancestor of the modern bedtime podcast, except with the faint smell of paraffin oil in the air. Not everyone was convinced. Medical journals of the day, always ready to take the fun out of something, warned that the moving light might excite the imagination unduly and cause dreams of a disturbing character. Translation, you might get nightmares. One sensationalist pamphlet even claimed that a man in Leeds awoke screaming after a dream in which the moon descended to devour him. Though frankly, that sounds more like a personal problem than a lantern defect. Still, the hypnotic lantern's charm was undeniable. In an age before electric light was common, this was low-light therapy with an accidental touch of magic. You could lie in bed, listening to the faint tick and hum of the mechanism, while your ceiling became an ever-changing canvas. The warmth from the lamp would take the chill off the night air, and the amber glow softened every sharp corner, turning the whole room into a golden cocoon. Outside, a carriage might roll past, the clip-clop of hooves merging with the lantern's steady whir. Inside, time slowed to match the shadows. Some households even made an evening ritual of it. In one diary from 1894, a young woman describes how her father would set the lantern going in the children's bedroom, tell them to let the night carry you, and leave the door ajar so the faint notes of her mother's piano drifted in. It was, she wrote, a gentle theater for the mind, one without actors, plot, or end. And here's where the lantern's real magic lay. It didn't force sleep, it seduced it. In a culture obsessed with industriousness and self-control, here was a device that quietly said, you don't have to think right now. You could simply watch, let your eyes blur, and drift into that delicious gray area where thoughts tangle and unwind. Would it work today? Possibly, if you could ignore the temptation to check your phone mid-show. But maybe the point isn't whether the hypnotic lantern is more effective than melatonin or a white noise app. Maybe it's that in the Victorian imagination, even sleeplessness could be met not with frustration, but with a little theater, a little beauty, and the slow, certain promise that night would eventually take you in. If the hypnotic lantern whispered you into drowsiness with light and shadow, the Victorian sleep draft tried to shove you there chemically. And no, this wasn't your modern chamomile tea in a cute ceramic mug. It was a concoction that could make even your liver feel slightly alarmed. You sit at a small mahogany writing desk in a gas-lit bedroom. Outside, a drizzle streaks the glass. On the desk is a squat brown bottle, the label written in elegant copperplate, for restless nights and unquiet nerves. In smaller print, take 1 tablespoon in warm milk before retiring. There is no ingredient list. Why? Because you're in 1885, and nobody is legally required to tell you that you're about to ingest a syrup containing opium, chloral hydrate, and maybe a dash of alcohol for flavor. The mainstream fact here, Victorians often relied on laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, as a sleep aid. It was sold over the counter in chemist shops, prescribed liberally by doctors, and even included in some patent medicines for children. Mothers might give it to colicky infants, not entirely realizing that they were essentially dosing them with morphine in a sweetened solution. The fringe tidbit? There was once a night draft competition in Bristol where local chemists vied to create the most effective and palatable sleep mixture. The winner in 1892 was a syrup called Somnus Kiss, described in the Bristol Gazette as pleasant to the taste, swift in its embrace, and most forgiving come morning, which translated from Victorian advertising speak probably meant it knocked you out cold but didn't leave you retching at sunrise. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these drafts was driven more by genuine insomnia or by the era's appetite for mild, socially acceptable intoxication. After all, the same bottle that sent you to dreamland could be sipped during a dreary afternoon to make a lecture on agricultural yields suddenly fascinating. You imagine the ritual. The draft is poured into a porcelain cup, the viscous liquid catching the lamplight. Warm milk is added, swirling it into a faintly pinkish cloud. The first sip is syrupy, almost too sweet, masking the bitter medicinal undertone. Within minutes, your muscles loosen. Your eyelids become lead weights. The patter of rain outside turns into an orchestral lullaby. Of course, the Victorian medical establishment eventually caught on to the fact that these potions could be addictive or outright dangerous. There are grim case notes of over-sedation leading to accidental deaths, especially in the elderly. A few brave doctors began recommending herbal alternatives like valerian root or hops tea, but these lacked the instant knockout appeal of the chemical blends. One eccentric example, Dr. Percival Hodge of Bath claimed to have perfected a safe draft by mixing lettuce seed extract, honey, and just a whisper of brandy. He insisted it induced dreamless repose without taxing the constitution. Critics argued it induced nothing more than mild disappointment, but his patients, wealthy ladies with a fondness for novelty, swore by it. For the middle classes, buying a sleep draft was as ordinary as picking up cough drops. Advertisements appeared in ladies' magazines alongside dress patterns and household tips. For the weary mind and overtaxed body, somnolent syrup, your trusted night's companion. The illustrations showed angelic women reclining on chaise longues, their cheeks faintly flushed, a half-empty bottle on the side table. Not once did these ads depict the less glamorous reality of chemical grogginess the next morning or the occasional tumble down a staircase. There was even a curious overlap with the era's fascination for spiritualism. Some mediums claimed that a small dose of sleep draft before a seance heightened receptivity to messages from the beyond. Because, of course, if you're half-drugged, the ghost of your great-aunt probably does seem more chatty. As you lean back in your imaginary Victorian chair, you can see how the draft appealed. Life was slower, but also relentless. Industrial noise, gas fumes, constant social obligations, they wore people down. A guaranteed path to oblivion, even for a few hours, was hard to resist. And in the flickering half-light of an oil lamp, that amber liquid seemed almost benevolent. Would you take it? Maybe not, knowing what we know now. But you can't help picturing yourself in a high-backed bed, curtains drawn, the air tinged with the faint herbal anise scent of the draft. Outside, a hansom cab clatters past. Inside, the clock ticks, your pulse slows, and the boundary between waking and dreaming dissolves like sugar in warm milk. You're barely awake, still floating somewhere between memory and dream, when the next Victorian cure sidles in, not with bottles or steaming mugs, but with the promise of rearranging your very surroundings to trick your body into sleep. This was the era's grand belief in the sleep chamber, a perfectly engineered bedroom designed to coax even the most restless mind into surrender. You stand in the doorway of a stately townhouse, your candle casting soft light on a bedroom prepared with scientific precision. The walls are painted a muted sage green, believed to be the most calming shade in the palette of the day. The bed faces east so that the morning sun will wake you gently rather than blast you in the face. Heavy velvet curtains draped down to the floor, their folds swallowing the faint hum of carriage wheels outside. The mainstream historical fact here, many Victorians, influenced by both medical advice and a growing middle-class interest in domestic science, truly believed that the layout, color, and ventilation of a bedroom could cure insomnia. Doctors published pamphlets recommending exact room orientations, precise bed heights, and even the type of wood for bedsteads: oak for stability, pine for lightness of spirit. The fringe tidbit? Some manuals went so far as to suggest placing a small bowl of water under the bed to catch stray nervous energies as you slept. This wasn't mainstream medical advice. It leaned more toward the mystical end of the spectrum. But it caught on among certain fashionable households who treated it as both practical and just a little bit magical. Historians still argue whether these elaborate bedroom designs were genuinely about improving sleep, or if they were simply another expression of Victorian status and taste. After all, a scientifically arranged bedroom often required expensive furniture, rare fabrics, and custom carpentry, hardly within reach of the average working-class insomniac. As you walk further into this imagined space, you notice the bed itself, an iron frame polished to a gleam, dressed in linen sheets stiff from line drying. A single feather pillow rests on top. Two pillows, Victorians believed, could misalign the neck and cause disturbed dreams. A faint scent of lavender drifts from a sachet tucked under the pillowcase, the herb's aroma slowly released by the warmth of a sleeper's head. On the nightstand, there's a slim porcelain water jug and glass, a small handbell for calling the maid, and, because this is the Victorian age, a silver-mounted hairbrush you might never use but can't quite throw away. Beside it, a folded handkerchief embroidered with initials, ready to dab away any unladylike night sweats. The window is slightly ajar despite the chill. Fresh air, doctors insisted, was essential for sleep. Stale air was blamed for everything from morning headaches to general malaise. In cities thick with coal smoke, this advice was questionable, but the principle was clear. A sleeping body should never be cut off from the living world entirely. One popular home remedy book even recommended a pre-sleep ritual that involved stepping barefoot onto a sheepskin rug placed before an open window, inhaling deeply 3 times, and then diving straight into bed. Supposedly, the contrast between the cold air and the warm bedding reset the nervous system. In practice, it probably just made you appreciate the blankets more. For those who could afford it, there were sleeping porches or glassed-in balconies where the whole bed could be wheeled outside on mild nights. The idea was to merge the safety of the home with the freshness of nature, though this sometimes resulted in waking up with a fine layer of soot on your nightclothes in urban areas. Not everyone's sleep chamber was this serene. In boarding houses or shared lodgings, personal control over one's bedroom environment was minimal. Tenants improvised, hanging up makeshift curtains to block hallway light, stuffing cloth under doors to muffle sound, or placing bricks under bed legs to change the angle of the mattress, an early form of adjustable bed theory. There were also strong beliefs about what not to keep in the room. Plants, for example, were discouraged by some doctors who claimed they consumed the oxygen of the sleeping occupant. Others argued the opposite, that a geranium on the sill purified the air. The truth? Both sides were probably overstating things, But it didn't stop heated debates in household advice columns. Your candlelight flickers as you imagine lying here, the green walls fading to darkness, the lavender curling into your senses, the air cool but not biting. The outside world fades to an indistinct murmur. You can almost believe that this carefully arranged space has some secret power, that sleep is inevitable here. And perhaps that's the real trick. Half the cure is believing you've built the perfect nest. The Victorians, with all their quirks and contradictions, understood that the mind could be coaxed by its environment. Whether through a polished iron bed frame, a precise room orientation, or that mysterious bowl of water under the bed, they were crafting more than just a place to rest. They were building a stage set for sleep itself. Would it work for you? Maybe. Or maybe you'd lie there wondering if your nervous energies were politely dripping into that bowl instead of helping you drift off. But you'd still be surrounded by beauty, ritual, and the hope that tomorrow you'd wake feeling finally restored. You might think that the Victorians, with their fondness for lace, tea, and polite conversation, would draw the line at anything too heavy in the bedroom. You'd be wrong. Welcome to the strange world of weighted blankets of lead, a sleep cure that was as literal as it sounds and as alarming as it should be. Picture it. You're lying in a bed in 1884 London, the gas lamps outside guttering in the wind, and instead of a soft quilt, you're covered by a thick, cold sheet that feels like it's trying to pin you to the mattress. This is no accident. Victorian nerve doctors believed that pressure could soothe an overstimulated mind, and they were willing to go to extremes to make that happen. The mainstream explanation was that heavy coverings quiet the restless limbs and steady the racing pulse. It was an early, if questionable, form of what we'd now call deep pressure therapy. Today, weighted blankets are filled with glass beads or poly pellets. Back then, they were sometimes filled with small lead pellets sewn into quilted pockets, so the weight was evenly distributed. Yes, lead, the same toxic metal now banished from paint, pipes, and gasoline, was once snuggled up with sleepers under the guise of medical science. If you read period advertisements, you'd find glowing claims: a sure comfort for the agitated sleeper, a safe and natural sedation, and my personal favorite, a gentle hand upon the nerves. The idea was that the blanket would anchor the body, preventing tossing and turning, and send a subconscious message to the brain that it was safe to drift into slumber. The fringe detail here? Some designs incorporated small lead plates rather than pellets, arranged in patterns that supposedly corresponded to nerve meridians. It's unclear whether the plates did anything other than bruise shins if you shifted too quickly. But believers swore by them, claiming they woke refreshed as if the weight had squeezed the bad dreams right out of their bones. You might be wondering, didn't anyone suspect that sleeping under lead might be dangerous? The short answer is, not really. The dangers of lead exposure weren't widely recognized until later in the 19th century, and even then, it was mostly linked to industrial work or contaminated drinking water. The idea that you could absorb toxins just from skin contact or by breathing in dust from a blanket was far from common knowledge. Some households even combined the lead blanket with another Victorian favorite, hot water bottles. These would be slipped under the heavy cover, warming both the body and the lead so that in theory you'd fall asleep faster. In practice, this sometimes resulted in uncomfortable sweating, faintly metallic-smelling sheets, and a disturbing sense that you were being pressed into a very warm coffin. And yet, there were genuine reports of success. People with night tremors, as they called them, claimed that the blankets stopped their twitching. Children who were prone to sleepwalking were sometimes tucked in under these lead-laden covers, the weight preventing them from slipping out of bed unnoticed. One remarkable case, often cited in medical journals of the time, involved a man in Manchester who hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in over a decade. His doctor prescribed a 20-pound lead quilt. Within a week, the patient reported blissful repose and a new tranquility of mind. The article didn't mention whether his hair started falling out or if he developed any of the other telltale signs of lead poisoning. Of course, the method had its critics. Some physicians warned that the pressure could impede circulation or strain the heart, particularly in older patients. Others simply pointed out that it was unpleasantly hot and impractical, especially in the summer months. The majority of the working class who couldn't afford specialized bedding dismissed it as yet another fad of the wealthy. But for the devoted, this was more than a cure, it was a ritual. Before bed, the blanket would be folded carefully into thirds, then unfurled with the help of a servant. They were far too heavy for most people to manage alone. The sleeper would slip between the sheets. A maid or spouse would lay the leaded cover in place, and the room would fall quiet except for the faint clink of the pellets settling. In the dim candlelight, you can imagine the scene, the slow weight spreading over your chest, pressing you into stillness. Your breathing deepens. Your limbs, whether from relaxation or sheer immobility, stop fidgeting. Outside, the night wind rattles the shutters, but you feel anchored, unshakable. Looking back, it's tempting to scoff at the idea of using a toxic metal as a sleep aid. But in a strange way, the Victorians stumbled onto a truth we still recognize. Physical pressure can calm the nervous system. Modern weighted blankets, minus the lead and plus some common sense, are enjoying a resurgence in popularity. We've just swapped the lead pellets for glass beads, the medical jargon for wellness marketing. So, while you might not want to hunt down a genuine 19th century lead quilt, for reasons your doctor and your lungs would thank you for, you could say that this is one Victorian remedy that, once you remove the poison, has quietly endured. And as you lie there imagining the heft of that blanket, you might even understand the appeal. In a world as noisy, frantic, and uncertain as theirs, or ours, there's something deeply human about wanting the night to hold you down, to keep you still, to promise, in its quiet, crushing way, you're safe now. Sleep. If the Victorians were willing to put lead in their blankets, it should come as no surprise that they were equally willing to put electricity in their pillows. Yes, in the late 19th century, the same mysterious force that was lighting streets and animating bizarre scientific demonstrations was also marketed as a cure for insomnia, delivered to you in the very place you laid your head each night. The electric sleep pillow was a curious device that appeared in advertisements around the 1880s, often illustrated with delicate ladies reclining serenely, while tiny bolts of lightning danced around their pillow's edge. In reality, there were no visible sparks, thankfully, but there was a complex interior of copper coils, zinc plates, and in some cases, an attached battery pack hidden discreetly under the bed. The principle behind it was classic Victorian pseudoscience. The human body, they argued, is a kind of electrical machine, and if insomnia was a malfunction, it might be fixed by restoring the natural current of vitality. Proponents claimed that a mild electrical charge applied to the head could soothe the overactive nerves and induce the mind to rest. The earliest designs were purely passive, relying on the supposed galvanic influence generated by layers of dissimilar metals sewn into the pillow. These were based loosely on the work of Luigi Galvani, who had made frogs' legs twitch with electricity decades earlier. If a dead frog could be animated by metal plates, the thinking went, perhaps a restless human could be calmed by them. Later models got bolder and far more alarming. A few entrepreneurial inventors added wet sponges or saline-soaked cloths between the metal layers to increase conductivity. Others went all in with small direct current batteries, complete with wires running to the pillow's interior. Users were instructed to dampen their hair slightly before lying down to ensure good contact. You can imagine the unintended effects when the current was set too high. Rather than drifting off into peaceful slumber, some customers described a startling buzz in their scalp or even involuntary twitches in the jaw. Yet, despite these eyebrow-raising details, testimonials poured in. For the first time in years, I slept the whole night through, one London banker declared in a letter to the Pall Mall Gazette. Another customer praised the pillow for banishing the gloomy thoughts that plagued her at bedtime. Whether these results came from the electricity itself, the placebo effect, or simply the novelty of the contraption, we may never know. The fringe element came in when spiritualists began adopting the electric sleep pillow for purposes beyond sleep. They claimed the gentle current opened the psychic channels and made it easier to receive dreams or visions from the spirit world. A medium in Brighton famously used one every night, reporting that she awoke with messages from the departed already forming on her lips. Skeptics suggested that what she was experiencing was mild electrical stimulation of the brain combined with the vivid imagery of half-sleep. Of course, the scientific community was divided. Some doctors warned of potential risks, particularly for those with heart problems or weak constitutions. Others dismissed the pillow entirely, pointing out that the electrical charge delivered was far too weak to have any measurable physiological effect. Still, the device remained popular among the upper classes for at least a decade, buoyed by the Victorian faith in technology's power to solve nearly any problem. One inventor, a certain Edwin C. Branscombe, took the concept to absurd heights by creating the somno-electro cushion, which could be adjusted via a dial on the nightstand. He marketed it with the slogan, "From gentle hum to thunderous calm," an oxymoron, if ever there was one. At its highest setting, it reportedly caused hair to stand on end. Branscombe swore that this was simply stimulating the cranial currents before releasing them into tranquility. Several users swore it was more like a mild punishment before bed. In daily practice, using one of these pillows was a ritual. You'd remove it from a specially lined case, dampen your hair if instructed, check the battery or plates, and settle in. There'd be a faint metallic smell, sometimes a gentle warmth from the current. You might feel a tingling across your scalp, pleasant to some, irritating to others. Then, ideally, you'd drift off, lulled by the belief that science was quite literally recharging your brain. Inevitably, safety concerns began to pile up. A few sensational newspaper stories detailed incidents where faulty wiring caused small burns or scorched pillowcases. One case in Edinburgh involved a terrier who liked to sleep at the foot of the bed. After brushing against the wiring, the poor dog yelped so loudly it woke the whole household. That story did the rounds for weeks, much to the amusement of skeptics. By the early 20th century, the electric pillow had largely vanished, replaced by safer, more efficient insomnia cures, or simply by the realization that sleeping with a mild electric current buzzing through your skull might not be the most restful choice. Still, the idea of using electricity for relaxation never completely died. In fact, it found echoes later in devices like cranial electrotherapy stimulators, which are still marketed today, albeit with far stricter safety standards. Looking back, it's hard not to admire the sheer audacity of the electric sleep pillow. It's the kind of invention that perfectly captures the Victorian mix of optimism, naivete, and occasional recklessness. They believed in progress so fervently that they were willing to invite lightning into bed with them. Because, surely, if it could light the streets of London, it could light the way to a better night's sleep. And maybe, in their own way, they weren't entirely wrong. There's a certain romance to the idea of lying in the dark, a faint hum in your ear, feeling as though the world's newest and most mysterious force is coursing gently through you, not to harm, but to soothe, to mend, to grant you the gift of rest, even if it sometimes came with the side effect of hair standing straight up. If the electric sleep pillow was a bold flirtation with modern science, then the somnambulist's sea box was a nostalgic retreat into the comforting embrace of nature, albeit in a form only the Victorians could have conceived. The sea box was marketed as a maritime cure for the restless mind, an insomnia aid designed to replicate the soothing sounds and sensations of sleeping aboard a gently rocking ship at anchor. It was part of a short-lived craze in the 1890s for environmental therapeutics, the idea that specific sensory environments could be artificially recreated in the home to promote health and relaxation. At first glance, the sea box looked like an ornate wooden chest, about the size of a steamer trunk, placed at the foot of the bed. But this was no ordinary piece of furniture. The box contained a water-filled compartment, a small pump system, and a series of wooden paddles that dipped into the water and moved rhythmically. This mechanical motion created a faint sloshing sound, which was amplified by the box's hollow frame to mimic the noise of waves lapping against a hull. In addition to the sound, the device incorporated a subtle rocking mechanism. A pair of curved runners under the bed frame could be engaged via a hand crank, or in more expensive models, a small clockwork motor. Once activated, the bed would sway gently, just enough to create the sensation of being afloat. The marketing claimed that this gentle rocking would harmonize the inner fluids of the body, borrowing language from ancient humoral theory that was already falling out of scientific favor, but still sounded reassuring to lay customers. The more elaborate versions went even further. Some included salt-scented vapor diffusers to imitate the tang of sea air. One model, the Oceanic No. 3, even had a rotating panorama, an illustrated strip of canvas depicting calm, moonlit waters, that could be viewed through a small brass spyglass mounted on the headboard. The idea had a surprisingly strong basis in experience. Many Victorians had traveled by ship for leisure or necessity, and some genuinely found it easier to sleep on board than at home. Letters published in periodicals told of people who had not known a whole night's rest in years, save when crossing the channel. The sea box promised to bring that magic home, no matter how far inland one lived. One early champion of the device was Captain Reginald Weatherby, a retired naval officer who swore it cured his lifelong tendency toward overexcitable nerves. He claimed to have purchased two, one for himself and one for his sister, who lived in the countryside and had never set foot on a ship, but nonetheless found herself lulled into dreams of distant voyages. But for all its charm, the sea box had its drawbacks. The water reservoir needed regular refilling and cleaning, or the scent of the sea air turned distinctly swampy. In winter, the sloshing water could chill the bedroom noticeably, leading some owners to drain it until spring, at which point the device was useless. The rocking mechanism, too, could be temperamental. Poorly maintained clockwork motors sometimes jerked instead of swayed, giving the unsettling impression of being on a ship about to founder. Then there were the mishaps. One notorious incident involved a sea box whose pump failed during the night, slowly leaking briny water across the bedroom floor. By morning, the rug was ruined, the skirting boards warped, and the owner's cat, who had chosen that moment to explore, was decidedly unimpressed. The device also drew criticism from medical skeptics. Some physicians scoffed at the idea that environmental mimicry could treat true insomnia, warning that one cannot simply rock away a disordered mind. Others argued that while the sea box might be pleasant for the healthy sleeper, it risked masking underlying illnesses that required attention. Despite this, sales were steady among the wealthy, and the sea box enjoyed a brief vogue in country estates and seaside villas alike. Guests would often be invited to try the cure for an afternoon nap, and reports of sudden drowsiness, whether from the rocking or simply the novelty, were common. The most curious footnote in its history comes from a group of early psychologists who experimented with the sea box in studies of dream imagery. They claimed that subjects using the device were more likely to dream of water, travel, or distant shores. In one paper, a researcher noted that the subconscious mind appears susceptible to the suggestion of motion and sound, weaving them into the tapestry of dream. By the turn of the century, however, the sea box began to fade from popularity. The new century's fascination with electricity, machinery, and scientific modernity made the device seem quaint, even old-fashioned. The cost of production was high, and cheaper, more compact noise-making devices began to appear, such as simple wind-up music boxes playing soft lullabies. Today, surviving examples of the sea box are rare, often found in maritime museums or the collections of antique sleep device enthusiasts. Those who have tried restored versions describe the experience as oddly effective, if a little disconcerting, especially when you open your eyes in the morning expecting to see open water only to find your wallpaper staring back at you. It's tempting to laugh at the contraption, but there's something undeniably touching about it. In an age when travel was slower, more dangerous, and more expensive, the sea box offered a safe, gentle voyage every night. It was the promise of far-off horizons without leaving the safety of one's own bed. And perhaps that was its real gift, not just sleep, but the dream of adventure, softly cradled on the waves of imagination. If the somnambulist's sea box promised gentle waves and maritime dreams, the mechanical Sandman apparatus delivered its sleep cure with all the subtlety of a clockmaker's prank. Patented in 1894 by a certain Horace Penwell of Birmingham, the device combined the Victorian love of whimsical engineering with an earnest, if slightly unsettling, desire to mimic the mythical Sandman's visit. The apparatus consisted of a polished mahogany frame mounted to the headboard, from which extended a delicate gear-driven arm tipped with a small mesh pouch. Inside this pouch was a blend of fine ground chamomile, dried lavender petals, and, controversially, a dusting of powdered hops. The inventor swore this botanical cocktail would quieten the restless mind, soothe the senses, and prepare the sleeper for a voyage into the soft realms of dream. The arm, powered by a clockwork motor, was designed to swing gently over the sleeper's face at timed intervals. At a preset moment, typically 15 to 20 minutes after the occupant had lain down, the pouch would give a tiny shake, releasing a faint drift of herbal scent and a barely visible sprinkle of powder. The sensation was meant to replicate the legendary Sandman scattering dream dust into your eyes. It sounds charming, until you realize that in practice, the powder could sometimes land in precisely the wrong way. Even the finest ground chamomile can tickle a nostril, and reports of sneezing fits or sudden snorts mid-slumber were not uncommon. In one letter to the Household Gazette, a lady from Bath complained that her husband had been so startled by the mid-sleep herbal shower that he leapt from bed, upsetting the kerosene lamp and nearly setting the curtains alight. Despite such hazards, Penwell marketed his invention enthusiastically, advertising in illustrated catalogs alongside magic lanterns and self-playing pianos. The ads depicted a serene woman in lace nightclothes, smiling in her dreams while a tiny mechanical arm hovered like a guardian angel. Beneath the image ran the slogan, "He sprinkles, you slumber." To appeal to wealthier customers, Penwell offered custom scent blends, rose attar for the romantically inclined, eucalyptus for those with stubborn chest vapors, and even cinnamon clove for the gentleman who prefers a spiced repose. A deluxe version had a pair of synchronized arms, one for each side of the bed, so that couples could be dusted at the same moment, preserving marital harmony in nocturnal therapies. Intriguingly, some early adopters were not plagued insomniacs at all, but amateur hypnotists and stage magicians. They found the apparatus useful for creating a mild sensory suggestion before performance. A performer named Professor Lumen reportedly used it backstage before seances, believing the scent of lavender calmed both himself and his more nervous patrons. Medical opinion was, predictably, divided. Herbalists praised the blend as a legitimate soporific aid, citing centuries of tradition in using chamomile and hops for relaxation. Mainstream physicians, however, were less convinced. They argued that the dose delivered by the Sandman apparatus was too small to have any real physiological effect, and that any benefits were purely psychological, though they conceded that psychology could be powerful in cases of mild sleeplessness. Some detractors were more cutting. A columnist in Punch lampooned the device as a bedtime pepper pot for those too idle to boil tea. The humor landed, but Penwell, ever the optimist, wrote a rebuttal in which he insisted that the dreamer's first breath is the most sacred moment of repose, and it ought to be perfumed by design, not by chance. Of course, no Victorian gadget was safe from misadventure In at least one recorded incident, a poorly maintained apparatus leaked its herbal contents directly onto the pillow, leaving the sleeper's hair dusted like a sugared bun. Children found this hilarious and began helping by overfilling the pouch, leading to many snowdrifts of lavender across the bedroom. The most bizarre twist in the mechanical Sandman's history came in 1897, when an experimental soothing powder containing trace amounts of bromide was introduced. Bromides were a common sedative of the era, but the inclusion of even a minute quantity in an airborne form alarmed health officials. Though no serious harm was documented, the potential for accidental overexposure, especially in children, led to swift regulation, and the bromide blend was banned within a year. Without its more potent variant, sales of the Sandman apparatus declined. The novelty wore off, and the complexities of winding, refilling, and cleaning the delicate arm became too much for all but the most dedicated sleepers. By 1905, Penwell had shifted his attention to another curious invention, a mechanical dawn rooster that crowed precisely at sunrise, which, sadly, never achieved the same brief notoriety. Today, the few surviving Sandman apparatuses are treasured by collectors of mechanical oddities. When restored to working order, they can still deliver their delicate puff of lavender, though modern owners wisely substitute the powder with something inert, like rice flour. There's a peculiar intimacy to watching that little clockwork arm arc gracefully over the pillow, sprinkling its gift as though the dream world required an official invitation. In the end, the mechanical Sandman was less about science than ritual. It embodied the Victorian belief that sleep was not a passive collapse into unconsciousness, but an event worth staging, complete with scent, sensation, and the soft tick of well-oiled gears. Whether or not it truly cured insomnia is beside the point. For those who used it, it transformed bedtime into a performance, with the Sandman himself, brass-jointed and mahogany-bodied, playing the lead role. If the Sandman apparatus was a clockmaker's nod to bedtime mythology, the nighttime harmonium was a composer's lullaby, given brass, wood, and wind. Designed in 1889 by Madame Eloise Fontaine, a Parisian music tutor with a flair for mechanical tinkering, this peculiar instrument was intended to massage the soul into sleep through the gentle pressure of sound waves. At first glance, the nighttime harmonium looked like a miniature pump organ, polished walnut casing, ivory keys, decorative brass grill, but it wasn't meant for playing hymns or salon music. Instead, it was pre-programmed in the most Victorian sense of the term, an internal cylinder studded with pins, much like a music box mechanism, turned slowly by a wind-up clockwork motor. As it rotated, the pins lifted tiny levers that allowed air to pass through selected reeds, producing a steady, hushed chord progression. Madame Fontaine claimed the sequence was scientifically designed to match the natural deceleration of the heartbeat as one drifted into slumber. The opening chords were rich and warm, like an autumn evening. Over 20 minutes, they would soften, the intervals stretching, the dynamics sinking to a mere whisper. If you listened closely, assuming you stayed awake that long, you might hear a final, barely audible note before the bellows fell silent. The nighttime harmonium was marketed not just as a sleep aid, but as a piece of fine furniture. Its legs were gracefully turned, its veneer polished to a mirror finish. Wealthy households often placed it in the bedroom corner, draped with lace, as much a conversation piece as a therapeutic device. But there were challenges. For one, the instrument had to be wound daily, and the brass reeds needed regular cleaning to prevent the faintest wheeze or whistle from marring the effect. Any dust or humidity could throw the delicate tuning off, leading to unintentionally comical outcomes. An intended C-sharp resolving into a honky, nasal D, or a soothing G chord suddenly warbling like a drunk nightingale. Reviews were mixed. Some owners swore by its calming influence, claiming they could fall asleep before the piece reached its third minute. Others found the constant hum distracting, particularly those unaccustomed to mechanical music. One letter to Le Petit Journal described it as like being sung to by an invisible ant who refuses to stop hovering at your bedside. The most enthusiastic adopters were those already enamored with the burgeoning field of music therapy. The late 19th century saw a surge of interest in the idea that sound vibrations could heal the body and mind. Some physicians, particularly in Paris and Vienna, experimented with music as a treatment for hysteria, melancholy, and nervous conditions. Madame Fontaine, who moved in artistic and semi-medical circles, capitalized on this trend, often demonstrating her harmonium at salons attended by both composers and doctors. She also offered sleep scores tailored to individual clients. A patient prone to nightmares might receive a progression in the key of F major, thought to be gentle and pastoral. An anxious businessman might be prescribed D-flat major, considered grounding and dignified. Fontaine's marketing was as much poetic as it was pseudo-scientific, but it resonated with the Victorian appetite for personal, bespoke remedies. Inevitably, imitators emerged. By 1895, cheaper harmonium-like devices, some little more than disguised music boxes with a padded cover, flooded the market. They lacked the tonal nuance of Fontaine's original and sometimes played tunes far less soporific. A notorious knockoff sold in London played a cheerful polka at half speed. The result was less lullaby than eerie carnival dirge. In one of the more charming anecdotes from the harmonium's heyday, a French family reported that their cat, usually restless at night, began curling up on the instrument's top whenever it was playing. The gentle vibration seemed to lull the animal into purring synchrony with the chords. Madame Fontaine seized on this, printing an advertisement featuring a sleeping cat beneath the headline, "If it soothes the feline, imagine what it will do for you." Despite its romantic appeal, the nighttime harmonium faced a slow decline as gramophones entered the market. By the turn of the century, people could buy records of orchestral lullabies or pastoral nocturnes, no winding required. The harmonium, with its upkeep and quirks, began to seem quaint, yet it left a curious legacy. Some modern sleep researchers have noted parallels between Fontaine's harmonic sequences and today's binaural beats, or isochronic tones, audio patterns designed to influence brainwave activity. Whether by intuition or experimentation, Fontaine had stumbled onto a principle still explored in contemporary sleep science. That gentle, predictable sound patterns can help the mind release its grip on wakefulness. Surviving examples of the nighttime harmonium are rare, partly because their reeds corroded over time and their clockwork mechanisms wore out with daily use. Collectors prize them not only for their craftsmanship, but for the romance they represent. An era when even falling asleep could be treated as a kind of art, accompanied by a private concert no one else could hear. In the end, The nighttime harmonium was less about forcing the body into rest than about creating a space in which rest felt possible. The low, sustained chords were like a sonic quilt, wrapping the listener in a soundscape of deliberate stillness. And in an age when insomnia was often seen as a moral failing or a sign of nervous excess, Madame Fontaine offered something gentler: permission to surrender to sleep, one fading note at a time. If the nighttime harmonium whispered the language of dreams, the somnambulist's lantern spoke in shadows. Introduced in 1892 by German inventor Herr Otto Kessler, this contraption was billed as a mechanical moonlight tamed for the bedroom. It promised to replace the harsh glare of oil lamps or the unpredictable flicker of candles with a steady, hypnotic glow, supposedly ideal for coaxing even the most stubborn insomniac into slumber. At first glance, it looked like a tall brass candlestick mated with a miniature observatory dome. Inside the dome, instead of a flame, sat a small, low-heat electric bulb, still a novelty at the time, shielded by layers of frosted glass and thin mica sheets. But the true magic lay in the lantern's rotating shade, a drum of parchment panels, each hand-painted with delicate silhouettes of forests, night skies, and meadows. Slowly turned by a tiny clockwork motor, the shade cast a procession of soft, moving shapes across the bedroom walls. Kessler's marketing claimed the human brain was wired to respond to the primal language of moonlight and shadow. Watching the silhouettes drift past, branches swaying, stars twinkling, a lone stag pausing in a meadow, was said to nudge the mind toward a dream state. The movement was deliberately slow, with a full rotation taking nearly 20 minutes, so the scenes repeated in a rhythm gentle enough to blur conscious thought. As with many Victorian curiosities, part of the appeal was the story behind it. Kessler was not a showman, but a meticulous clockmaker from Leipzig, reputedly inspired by his insomniac wife, Greta. According to family letters, Greta often found that strolling in the moonlit garden eased her restless nights. When winter made such walks impossible, Otto resolved to bring the garden indoors. Thus began a 2-year experiment with lenses, light diffusers, and paints that glowed softly without burning. The lantern quickly became a sought-after bedroom accessory among the upper middle class, especially in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Fashionable magazines recommended pairing it with pale blue wallpaper and lace curtains to maximize the lunar illusion. Its novelty also made it a popular wedding gift, pitched as a symbol of shared nights and peaceful dreams. Yet, like all insomnia cures of the age, the somnambulist's lantern had its quirks. Early models were prone to a faint ticking sound as the shade turned, soothing to some, maddening to others. Owners with particularly keen hearing reported that the clockwork seemed to grow louder in the quiet of the night until it became less lullaby and more metronome for insomnia. Then there were the scenes themselves. Kessler initially painted them all himself, a laborious process that limited production. As demand grew, he hired artists of varying skill. While some panels were masterfully subtle, mist-shrouded valleys, silvered lakes, others featured oddly proportioned wildlife or trees that looked suspiciously like broccoli. Critics, in satirical papers, seized on these imperfections, publishing cartoons of startled sleepers waking to find a giant cabbage looming on their wall. Still, many found the lantern genuinely calming. Diaries from the period record people lying in bed, half listening to the slow tick, watching the silhouettes melt into each other until they slipped into unconsciousness. One particularly poetic user described it as watching one's thoughts grow wings and drift away. Kessler, ever the craftsman, continued to refine the design. By 1895, he had introduced a nearly silent motor and interchangeable scene drums, allowing owners to swap forest nocturne for seaside twilight or alpine moonrise. The seaside version, with its rolling wave patterns, became unexpectedly popular among city dwellers, who claimed it cooled their minds in the summer heat. The lantern also found a small but curious audience among early psychologists. Some theorize that the moving images engaged the brain's visual centers in a way that distracted it from ruminative thoughts, a Victorian cousin to today's sleep meditation videos. Others warned that for certain overstimulated constitutions, the shadows might encourage vivid dreams or even sleepwalking. A few physicians went so far as to recommend the lantern as a treatment for nightmares in children, reasoning that replacing uncontrolled dark with predictable gentle images could ease fears. Despite its charm, the somnambulist's lantern eventually succumbed to the same fate as the nighttime harmonium, changing technology. By the early 1900s, more affordable electric lamps and projected slideshows offered brighter, more varied imagery. Kessler's invention faded into the realm of cherished heirlooms, passed down in families or left to gather dust in attics. Today, surviving examples are rare, partly because the parchment drums were fragile and easily torn. Collectors prize those with original paintings intact, especially the earliest series signed by Kessler himself. Occasionally, one turns up at an auction, still functional. The winning bidder often describes turning it on that very night, just to see the room transformed into a moving dreamscape of long-vanished artistry. The somnambulist's lantern stands as a reminder of the Victorian willingness to invest in elaborate, almost theatrical environments for sleep. Where modern solutions often focus on stripping away stimulus, blackout curtains, white noise machines, Kessler's vision embraced a gentle, curated stimulation, a play of light and shadow designed not to rouse, but to soothe. In an age when electricity was still a marvel and moonlight itself seemed part of the natural poetry of life, it offered a way to capture something ephemeral and keep it close. It was, in a sense, a love letter to the night, one that glowed softly, turned slowly, and promised that in its shadows lay not fear, but rest. If the somnambulist's lantern captured the romance of shadow and light, the aromatic slumber cabinet sought to woo the restless mind through the nose. Introduced in 1894 by Madame Clarice Montreuil, a Parisian perfumer turned sleep consultant, this ornate wooden box promised to deliver the fragrances of peace directly to the sleeper's bedside in carefully timed intervals throughout the night. At a glance, the cabinet looked like a small polished mahogany writing desk, but instead of drawers for papers, it housed 3 sliding trays, each holding a porcelain dish filled with aromatic compounds. The device was equipped with a clockwork mechanism that would, at set times, open a small vent above one dish, allowing the scent to escape into the room. Once the appointed interval ended, the vent would close and the next would open, releasing a new fragrance. The goal was to mimic the natural sensory journey of a night outdoors, beginning with the earthy, grounding smells of a twilight garden, shifting to the cool freshness of a midnight breeze, and ending with the gentle sweetness of dawn. Madame Montreuil was a formidable marketer. In her advertisements, she claimed that different scents could calm the electric storms of the brain and guide the spirit down the river of dreams. She drew upon popular pseudo-scientific theories of the day, which held that smell was directly tied to the subconscious and could influence the tone and content of dreams. The cabinet's default fragrance sequence was as follows: lavender and chamomile to untie the knots of thought, mint and pine resin to refresh the inner sky, orange blossom and vanilla to escort the soul into morning. These scents were prepared in solid form using waxy bases infused with essential oils to prevent accidental spillage. Wealthier customers could commission custom blends, including rarer ingredients like ylang-ylang, frankincense, or Mysore sandalwood. The experience was undeniably theatrical. Owners would wind the clockwork, place the cabinet near the head of the bed, and drift off as the first wave of fragrance drifted over them. The mechanism made almost no sound, so the transition between scents often went unnoticed until morning, when the sleeper awoke, surrounded by the faint sweetness of the final blend. Reactions varied. Many users swore the cabinet transformed their nights, making sleep deeper and dreams more pleasant. Some even claimed it gave them control over dream settings. "I can walk in gardens whenever I wish," wrote one satisfied customer in a letter to Madame Montreuil. But not all responses were glowing. Critics argued that the constant introduction of new smells could just as easily rouse a sleeper, particularly if the scent was unfamiliar or too strong. There were also reports of pets being inexplicably attracted to the device, with one notorious case involving a cat knocking over the entire cabinet in pursuit of the orange blossom dish. Montreuil defended her invention fiercely, hosting salon evenings where guests could experience the aromatic slumber cabinet in person. These gatherings became something of a Parisian curiosity, drawing a mix of socialites, journalists, and curious physicians. The salons were dimly lit, with guests reclining on chaise lounges as the cabinet cycled through its sequence. Soft harp music played, and Montreuil, dressed in flowing violet silk, would speak about the olfactory gates of the dream world. There was a certain practicality to her method. In an era before central heating or air filtration, bedroom air could be stale, smoky, or tainted by street odors. The cabinet's gentle scents masked these less pleasant realities, creating a controlled sensory environment. It was, in effect, an early form of aromatherapy diffuser, though far more elaborate and expensive. The cabinet also tapped into the Victorian fascination with ordering the night. Just as timed mechanical feeders were beginning to appear for poultry, here was a device that could feed the sleeper's senses at regular intervals. This appealed to the era's belief that every aspect of life, even unconscious life, could be improved through planning and technology. Yet the aromatic slumber cabinet's moment in the spotlight was brief. By 1898, Montreuil faced competition from cheaper, simpler scent diffusers, many of which used alcohol burners or electric fans to spread fragrance. Her elaborate clockwork mechanisms were costly to produce, and the porcelain dishes required careful handling. Moreover, the emerging medical establishment began to question whether such devices truly improved sleep or merely provided a pleasant placebo. Montreux's clientele slowly dwindled, though she retained a devoted niche of loyalists, particularly among older patrons who had used the cabinet for years and swore they could no longer sleep without it. She continued to make small batches into the early 1900s, each stamped with her signature in gold leaf. But production ceased entirely after her death in 1911. Today, surviving aromatic slumber cabinets are exceedingly rare. The delicate clockwork often rusted if improperly stored, and the wooden casings were susceptible to warping. Occasionally, one surfaces at an antique fair, its porcelain dishes still faintly scented despite more than a century's passage. Collectors treasure these finds, not just for their mechanical ingenuity, but for the glimpse they offer into a time when sleep itself was seen as an art form worth curating. The aromatic slumber cabinet reminds us that, for the Victorians, sleep was not simply the absence of wakefulness. It was an experience to be shaped, guided, and, if possible, perfected. In this pursuit, they were willing to combine science, art, and a touch of theater, all in the hope that a better night's rest might lead to a better life. If the aromatic slumber cabinet appealed to the refined senses of the urban elite, the somnus harmonium targeted a more universal craving, the comfort of sound. Created in 1896 by the inventive but eccentric Cornelius Hargrave of Bristol, this curious contraption promised to lull the weary mind with orchestrated whispers of night. In reality, it was part music box, part wind machine, part impractical marvel, an attempt to engineer the very soundtrack of sleep. The somnus harmonium stood about 4 feet tall, housed in a varnished walnut case with brass filigree accents and a glass front panel through which the clockwork mechanism could be admired. At its heart was a rotating drum, much like that of a player piano, studded with precisely placed pins. As the drum turned, these pins would pluck tuned metal tines, strike miniature chimes, and activate hidden bellows that produced soft bursts of air through organ-like pipes. The resulting effect was a layered tapestry of sound, gentle arpeggios in the high register, low humming drones, and a faint, almost imperceptible rush like wind moving through leaves. Hargrave's patent claimed the device could be custom tuned to mimic any desired nighttime environment. One setting offered a summer meadow mix, light chimes, bird-like trills, and a barely there breeze. Another evoked a harbor at dusk, with deeper tones, intermittent gull calls, produced by a peculiar reed mechanism, and the faint lap of water, simulated by small beads rolling inside a hollow drum. But the most popular program was the moonlit garden, a sequence of slow, repeating harp notes over a steady, calming hum. Victorians had long appreciated the soothing effects of background noise. Many urban households kept small water fountains in the home to mask the racket of the street. The somnus harmonium, however, elevated this to a personal science. By delivering sound in a predictable, looping pattern, Hargrave argued, the machine could entrain the listener's breathing and heart rate, leading to more rapid and sustained sleep. In practice, opinions varied. Admirers described the effect as dreamlike, almost hypnotic, especially when used in a darkened bedroom. They reported slipping into slumber without the racing thoughts that usually plagued them. Detractors, however, complained that the mechanical clicks of the moving parts were distracting, and that the artificial gull cries were more like a child's whistle than nature's voice. One satirical magazine quipped that the Somnus harmonium was a lullaby for the imagination, so long as the imagination is hard of hearing. Despite these mixed reviews, Hargrave's invention attracted a loyal niche of customers, chiefly artists, musicians, and insomniacs who had tried everything else. He toured the country with demonstration models, setting them up in hotel lounges and railway station waiting rooms where passers-by could recline in wicker chairs and test the soundscapes. Many a traveler missed a train after nodding off mid-demo. One of Hargrave's boldest marketing moves was to create bespoke sound portraits for wealthy clients. By interviewing them about their favorite holiday destinations or childhood memories, he would compose a unique sequence for their harmonium, complete with custom drum pins and hand-tuned pipes. This service came at a staggering price, but in an age of bespoke tailoring and private portraits, the idea of a personalized sonic environment fit right in. The Somnus harmonium also intersected with a Victorian fascination for scientific dreaming. Several popular sleep manuals of the time argued that sensory input during slumber could shape the dream narrative. Hargrave leaned into this, suggesting that his moonlit garden program might induce gentle nocturnal wanderings among fragrant blossoms, while the harbor at dusk could summon visions of safe voyages and tranquil seas. The idea appealed to the era's blending of mysticism and emerging neuroscience, half art, half pseudoscience. Still, the harmonium had its limitations. The clockwork mechanism required daily winding, and the tension springs tended to wear out within a year, leading to erratic tempos. In humid weather, the bellows leather stiffened, producing wheezes that turned the serene breeze effect into something like an asthmatic sigh. Hargrave tried to address these issues in later models, but the device never quite shed its reputation as charmingly unreliable. By the early 1900s, competition arrived in the form of simpler, electrically powered sound machines, devices that could play wax cylinder recordings of ocean waves or rustling leaves without the need for complex mechanics. These were cheaper, easier to maintain, and less prone to unintentional noises. Hargrave stubbornly refused to adapt his designs to electricity, insisting that true rest requires the quiet heartbeat of clockwork. Unfortunately, this stance hastened his invention's decline. Today, the Somnus harmonium is a rare collector's item, prized both for its craftsmanship and its peculiarity. A handful survive in museums where they are sometimes restored to working order for special demonstrations. Visitors who hear them in action often describe the sound as oddly comforting, despite, or perhaps because of, the faint, mechanical imperfections. In an era when our devices can produce infinite flawless soundscapes at the touch of a button, there is something disarmingly human about a machine that tries so hard to imitate nature and doesn't quite succeed. The story of the Somnus harmonium is, in many ways, the story of Victorian insomnia cures as a whole, an earnest blending of art, science, and showmanship, driven by a belief that rest could be engineered with enough ingenuity. It was neither the most practical nor the most effective device of its day, but it remains one of the most evocative, proof that sometimes the journey to sleep is as fascinating as the destination. Over the course of these 30 sections, We've wandered through the dimly lit parlors, cramped bedrooms, and eccentric workshops of a bygone era. An era where insomnia was not merely a private frustration, but a public fascination. Victorian inventors, physicians, and entrepreneurs saw sleeplessness not only as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to blend science, spectacle, and style into curious objects and elaborate rituals. From hypnotic lanterns casting gentle moving shadows to clockwork sound machines imitating moonlit gardens, these creations were as much about the experience of attempting sleep as they were about the outcome. Whether they worked depended largely on the person using them and perhaps on the power of suggestion. Yet the persistence of such devices, despite questionable results, tells us something timeless. People will go to remarkable lengths for rest. These cures reveal the Victorian mind at its most inventive and most contradictory, devout in its belief in technology's promise, yet unafraid to embrace the mystical, the symbolic, and the downright theatrical. In an age before digital screens and synthetic sedatives, the pursuit of slumber could involve scents, sounds, textures, and elaborate choreography designed to signal to body and mind that the day's labors were done. In our own century, we have quieter bedrooms, softer mattresses, and endless playlists of ocean waves at our fingertips. Yet the anxiety about sleep, the desire to achieve it, measure it, and improve it, remains familiar. Perhaps that's why Victorian insomnia cures still fascinate us. They stand as charming reminders that rest is as much an art as it is a science. So tonight, if you find yourself staring at the ceiling, think of the Victorians. Imagine the soft chime of a somnus harmonium or the gentle glow of a hypnotic lantern. And remember, you're part of a long, strange human tradition of chasing sleep through imagination as much as invention.